All right. Hey, everyone. Today is October 11th, 2024. I'm Chris Lucas. This is my show, The Protestant View. Today, my special guest again will be Herb Solinsky, and he'll be going over the biblical calendar. And this time, we're going to be focusing on the equinox discussion because we didn't cover that. I don't think we covered that at all last time. So,
No, we really did not. We covered the barley and various items that people who want to use the barley to determine the first month of the year. We discussed all of those things and the reason why they don't really prove that the barley should be used. That was the goal, to present evidence, purported evidence, claimed evidence by people that want to use the barley and explain why it isn't real evidence. That's what we did the first time. And the second half is focusing on where and how the Bible shows that the vernal equinox is used for the first month. That's the goal for the second part, which is for today.
all right. So, I guess whenever you want to just start diving right on into it.
All right. We're really going to start in chapter 14. However, I wanted to review one scripture in chapter 4 before we go to chapter 14. In chapter 4, we discussed Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And what it says there is this, and it's on the screen now. And the Almighty said, "Let there be light bearers in the expanse of the heavens, to separate between the daytime and the night, and let them be for signs and for appointed times and for days and years." Now, the word appointed times is a word that is used a half a dozen times in Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 is a chapter that gives a full list of all of the festivals, all of the holy days. And the word appointed times is used in Leviticus 23 to give a summary expression. It's translated often festivals. However, to be consistent, I'm always translating it appointed times. I like to be consistent whenever it's possible. And all of the festivals are appointed times. That's the Hebrew word moed, used in the plural in Genesis 1:14. And so it's the light bearers that are for that purpose. In other words, it indicates since the festivals are embedded within the calendar, they are embedded as part of the calendar. The calendar focuses on the appointed times. This verse shows that the light bearers in the expanse of the heavens are what determine the appointed times, the light bearers. And I did mention last time that it doesn't say lights. It's a different Hebrew word than the word for lights. It is light bearers. And it's the word light itself is the Hebrew word or, O-H-R. But this is not or. It has a beginning part that's different. Ma. In other words, light bearers is ma'or. And it focuses attention on the actual lights in the heavens, not merely the fact that they give light, although, yes, they do give light, but it points attention to the light bearers, the actual items in the sky that emit light. Now, it's true that the moon does not emit its own light. It reflects light from the sun, but it's still a light bearer from the standpoint that when you look in the sky, you see it, and you see it lit up more and more as the month goes on, from its beginning as a crescent to a full moon, then back smaller and smaller until the old crescent, and then it vanishes for 1 to 3 days, where you don't see it at all for 1 day, 1 night to 3 nights. 3 nights is the maximum you won't see it if you have clear weather. But the focus I wanted to bring here in reviewing Genesis 1:14 is the attention to the light bearers. And that is actually another reason why I don't use barley, because barley is focusing attention on a plant species. This is not focusing attention on a plant species. It's focusing attention on the actual light bearers in the sky. So what is it focusing on? It's focusing on the light bearers, not even merely the light, but it's an important principle, and it leads into chapter 14. And I'm going to have to click on slides until I get up to chapter 14. I'm not sure what slide it's on, because the actual document has fewer pages than this has slides, because I had to enlarge the font in order to get this. So I'm clicking, and I will eventually get to chapter 14. Might be getting close now. Still going to take a little bit. I've got the
That's
chapter.
understandable. What happens when you convert documents? It doesn't stay
Well,
all synced up.
if I wanted to enlarge the font, then I only get a piece of my original page in each slide. It was too tiny to see it on the actual slide unless I enlarge the font, and that's why there's a lot more slides than there are actual pages in the original document. Goal I'm getting up to is chapter 14. Takes a lot of slides to make it to chapter 14.
Because you probably had to double each page almost.
Okay, there we are.
All right.
Begins on page 66, slide 66, but not the page number of the document. I think it's about page 22 of the document or something about close to that. Anyway, here we are, light triggers. It has been established that the biblical year has the long-term average that equals the agricultural year. Genesis 1:14 mentions the light bearers in the heavens that determine the appointed times, and we just reviewed that. This is the summary statement of it. The comets, planets, and stars do not have a cycle that agrees with this long-term average. The sun is the only candidate. Now, I want to mention something here at this point, that when I say the sun is the only candidate. One of the things that I learned when I studied mathematics is that when you prove things, there are different techniques of proof. One of the techniques of proof is to say it has to be one of these choices, and then you eliminate all choices except one. And since there's only one choice left and everything else has been eliminated, that one choice that's left is the answer. It has to be one of them. And so this is that way. In other words, lights in the sky. What are the lights in the sky? You've got the sun, you've got the moon, you have comets, you have planets, and you have stars. That's it. Of course, now we have artificial satellites, but that's a separate matter, and they didn't have that. They're not necessarily lights in the sky. Anyway, but comets have their own period. Like Halley's Comet occurs once every 75 years. Halley's Comet comes back. And the planets all have their own cycle time around the sun. The stars, they appear hardly ever to move, although they actually do. They have a cycle of the stars that's 25,800 years in the cycle. So, but the only light in the sky, light bearer in the sky, that has a cyclical period to an observer on the Earth that approximates the agricultural year is the sun. And that's why the conclusion is the sun is the only candidate, because the moon doesn't have a number. When you're looking up at the moon, it doesn't have a number from 1 to 12 or 1 to 13. It doesn't have a number that tells you which is the first. So you can't tell which moon is the first one of the year. And that's why you have to have another light in the sky, a light bearer in the sky, to determine what the first one is. And that is the sun. The sun is the only one. It must determine some month that starts the year. This document has skipped over discussing the moon, and for the purpose of this document, it will be assumed that the reader agrees that the sighting of the new crescent begins the month. We could prove that separately, but that's another discussion, which we don't have time to get into in this series. The sun must determine which new crescent is the first one of the year. In order to understand what is intended from Genesis 1:14 for years, and the very, very last word of Genesis 1:14 is the word years. So it shows years are also determined by the light bearers in the sky, because years is the last word. In order to understand what is intended from Genesis 1:14 for years, we should look for a consistent pattern in what we already know about the beginning of days and months. In other words, we have a pattern. We're going to follow through with the pattern for days, the pattern for months. Light from the light bearers is a trigger for the events described. The light trigger for distinguishing a new day is the transition from the sun's rulership by daytime to the stars' rulership by night. Now, what about the moon? Why don't I say the moon's rulership by night? Well, every month there's from one night to 3 nights that you do not see the moon at all. And so for the day, you do not have total consistency when it comes to the moon, because the moon interrupts seeing itself from 1 to 3 nights, but the stars don't. Now, it's true it might be rainy and cloudy that prevent you from seeing the stars, but really it's the consistency of the stars. The rulership of the sun goes away when the rulership of the stars come out at night. Psalm 136, verses 8 and 9 is what that indicates. The rulership, the governance of the moon and stars at night, and the rulership of the sun by day. And so there's a transition from daytime to night. And the transition is seen by what rules. The rulership of the stars by night is what shows it. And so there's a light trigger. The light trigger is what rules. The light trigger for beginning a new month is the new crescent in the western sky with a maximum of 30 days a month. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14 declares that the light bearers themselves determine these matters, not a prediction. See, that's a problem. The calculated calendar of the Jews today is a prediction of the lights, and it's 80% of the time it's off by 1 day or 2 days. So it's a prediction, and it's close, but it's off by 1 or 2 days, 80% of the time. 20% of the time, it does make the right day, but it shows that the prediction is not exact. And Genesis 1:14 says it's the light bearers. It's not a prediction. It's not an approximate calculation of the lights. And so the actual Jewish calendar used, which is based on a calculation, is not what the Bible says. Simple. For these two events, the start of a day and the start of a month, there are two principles. The first one is the light trigger occurs at the beginning of the event. In other words, what starts a new day is the transition from light to darkness. That transition from light to darkness is what begins a new day. And that's the light trigger. It's that transition. Number two, well, the other light transition is this new crescent. When you finally see the new crescent after darkness of 1 to 3 days, that sighting of the new crescent is the trigger, the light trigger. And so we see principle number one, the light trigger occurs at the beginning of the event. Now, I could say in more detail that it is possible to have rain and clouds that prevent you from seeing the new crescent. But there are two principles in the Bible, two examples of showing that a month cannot have more than 30 days. I don't want to get into that now because that's not the focus for this particular seminar in two parts. It's focusing on the barley compared to the equinox. And so I'm not going to spend time on why a month can't have more than 30 days. Now, principle number two, only the lights from the light bearers themselves is involved. No advanced prediction or calculation is present. We should expect these two characteristics of a light bearer to apply to the determination of years. This continues the pattern. The pattern again is a light trigger occurs at the beginning of the event. And number two, only lights from the light bearers themselves is involved. Those are the two principles that we should look for determining how we know to start the first month of the year, how that's to happen. To continue this biblical pattern, we should expect these two characteristics of a light bearer to apply to the determination of each new year. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 12 has this expression, quote, from the beginning of the year, showing that a biblical year has a definite beginning. It will now be shown that a biblical year consists of a whole number of biblical months, rather than a smaller subdivision such as days. A biblical reason for this is that Numbers 28:14 has the Hebrew expression, Chodesh b'Chodesh l'Chadashei Hashanah. Now, the meaning of that, literal meaning is, quote, month by month for the months of the year. And that expression, month by month for the months of the year, implies that a year has to be a whole number of months. Okay, but idiomatically, it's often translated each month throughout the year, instead of literally month by month for the months of the year. Many translations just say each month throughout the year. Also, 1 Chronicles 27:1 has the Hebrew expression, Kodesh b'Kodesh l'kol b'Chadashei Hashanah, meaning literally month by month for all the months of the year, but idiomatically each month throughout the whole year. Hence, a biblical year consists of whole months, and the months are numbered as seen in Leviticus 23 and in Esther 9. In other words, you have months numbered 1, 2, 3. It's true that a few months have names, but it's generally the holy days are numbered in Leviticus 23, beginning with month number 1, which it does call Aviv. Now, Esther chapter 9 mentions that the Feast of Purim occurs every year in the 12th month. Since 12 months is approximately, a month is about 29 and a half days. A lunar month is about 29 and a half days. It's not exactly that, but it's close enough that we could approximate it. And since they're 12 months, 12 times 29 and a half, that is 354 days. But that's less than a solar year. Solar year is about 10 or 11 days more, sometimes 12. It's a leap year once in a while. Okay. And so there needs to be an occasional 13th month, because 354 days is not enough days to keep up with the solar year long term. So every now and then you have to add a 13th month. We need to consider a light trigger that determines the first month. To be consistent with the pattern, having the two characteristics described, we should seek a light trigger that identifies which new crescent is the first in the year. It should occur at or shortly before the event. That's point number one in the two triggers. It should occur at or shortly before the event. And the actual event is the new crescent that starts the year. But the light trigger must be at that point or shortly before. And the trigger should not require advanced prediction. As already mentioned, the sun must be involved. There are only 4 repeatable signs of the sun that recur in an annual pattern: the 2 equinoxes and the 2 solstices. Those are the 4 signs of the sun that repeat. Now, from the viewpoint of astronomy, primitive peoples were able to determine equinoxes without any calculation, just with observation. And there are different places in the world where primitive peoples have drawn something on an object where the sun will shine there that occurs on the days of the equinoxes. And even Indians in North America have such markers that show that they knew the day of the vernal equinox. Now, I'll point out here that the greatest pyramids, the 3 great pyramids in Egypt, have the base of it has 4 points like a square, the points of the square, and the 2 of the points of the square line up exactly east-west, and the sun shines along that east-west marker only on the days of the equinoxes. No other days of the year except the days of the equinoxes. And it shows that the ancient Egyptians were in fact able to determine the equinoxes because they built those pyramids, the 3 greatest pyramids, so that 2 of the points line up exactly a straight line on the days of the equinoxes. So the ancient Egyptians can easily determine it, and they haven't changed their position. From the time they were built until today, they still show that. So it shows that the orbit of the Earth in regard to the sun still there on the equinoxes throughout the whatever time went by from the time those 3 pyramids were built. And I'll mention another interesting fact, and that is that they have made a wood sample, and on the basis of the wood sample and radiocarbon dating from the wood sample, they're able to determine that the 3 greatest pyramids of Egypt were built right around the time of the flood, Noah's flood. When you go back to biblical chronology, you date the time of Noah's flood, and then you date the radiocarbon dating of the wood in those pyramids. It's just about the same thing. So right about the time of the flood is when those 3 great pyramids were built.
Now, is it after or before the flood were they built?
Well, the best one is the Khufu pyramid, and that one is slightly older than the others, and the radiocarbon dating indicates it was slightly before the flood. The other 2, it's hard to decide. It's so close to the flood, it's hard to pinpoint the other 2. It's an interesting question, but let's continue now. And so we have seen that there are 4 signs of the sun, the 2 equinoxes, the 2 solstices. Among these 4, only the vernal equinox fits the time of the year that the Israelites left Egypt for the following reasons. So we're going to see a couple of points in the scripture to indicate why the vernal equinox is the only one of those 4 that fits the bill. Jeremiah chapter 36 and verse 22. It says, "Now the king was sitting in the winter house in the 9th month, with a fire burning in the hearth before him." Now, that's an interesting thing. It was winter in the 9th month. This approximate statement shows that the 9th month occurs in the winter, Since there are roughly 3 months per season, this would imply that the 6th month occurs in the autumn, the 3rd month occurs in the summer, and the 1st month occurs in the spring. Of course, the spring begins with the vernal equinox. Another scripture that corroborates the involvement of the vernal equinox is Exodus chapter 34, verse 22, which calls the Feast of Weeks, quote, the first fruits of the harvest of wheat. This occurs in Israel from about mid-May through early July in terms of when the wheat is harvested. If you back up from this 50 days plus another 20, why 50? Because the count of the Feast of Weeks is a count of 50 days. That's where 50 comes in. But the count begins during the days of unleavened bread. Since the count begins during the days of unleavened bread, you have to have another group of a count of roughly 20 days until you begin to count for the Feast of Weeks. So you add up 50 plus 20, and it's about 2 months and 10 days. That's what 70 days comes out to. And so if you back up from the time of the wheat harvest, which begins about the middle of May, and you back up about 70 days, 2.5 months, that approximates the time of the vernal equinox. So we have two scriptures. This one, Exodus 34, verse 22, and the other one that we read just before this. Hence, two separate biblical identifiers lead to the vernal equinox. The timing of it is just about there. So the other three signs of the sun, they just can't work because of these two scriptures. The other three signs of the sun are too far away in time to be candidates. Thus, scriptural descriptive approximations are used to point to the vernal equinox as the only candidate for Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. Therefore, from Genesis 1:14, along with some helping scriptures, which we just mentioned, we note that the vernal equinox is the trigger of light from the sun that points to the new crescent that begins the first month. Next, consider why the vernal equinox must occur at or shortly before the first new crescent to fulfill the pattern and avoid advanced prediction. See, the first principle of the two is that the light trigger has to occur at or shortly before the event. Well, the event is the new crescent. And so the light trigger must occur at or shortly before that event of the new crescent in order to fulfill the pattern that's established for the start of a day and for the start of a month. Because we had these two principles that show a pattern, and we're just fulfilling the same pattern. Consider now, next, why the vernal equinox must occur at or shortly before the first new crescent to fulfill the pattern and avoid advanced prediction. For example, let us suppose that someone proposes that the first new crescent is the one for which the 15th day of that month is on or after the vernal equinox. That would mean when the new crescent for that month is seen, one would have to know in advance that when the 15th day arrives, it will be on or after the vernal equinox. Someone may argue, why should it matter whether we know in advance? Why can't people merely wait for the 15th day to arrive, till the 15th day arrives, and compare that with the vernal equinox? In other words, why is it necessary to know at the beginning of the month whether it is the first month or the 13th? Okay, we have a good biblical reason for that. Consider the people in ancient Israel and what they were expected to do for the first month. When people are expected to leave their homes to attend the Passover festival in one central location, and Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 5 through 7 points that. Well, I'm not going to read that those verses 5 through 7 of Deuteronomy 12, but it points out that 3 times in the year, people all over Israel are expected to go to one central location where the festival would be held and the priesthood would preside. And so people are expected to leave their homes to attend the Passover. Now, you may have to have a couple of hired servants stay behind to take care of the animals or something. So you don't necessarily have 100% of the entire population going to the central place 3 times a year, but you have the vast majority of them. And there may be a few people who have to be left behind at each place with his animals in order to feed the animals, take care of the animals. Cows have to be milked. Can't let them go for long periods of time without having the cows get milked. All right, let's go on. They need to know at the beginning of the month whether it is the first month or the 13th month, so they can make preparation. That's to go to the one central place for the Passover. In the middle of the month, and by the 14th day of the month, they have to slaughter the Passover lamb, sacrifice the Passover. So they have to start out long before the Passover to be sure that they're going to get there in time to witness the slaughtering of the Passover lambs and to be there for the first day, the first holy day, the 15th day of the first month, which is the first festival day of the 7 days of unleavened bread. So they have to start out in advance. To start out in advance, they have to know, is it the first month? They can't go and wait until the middle of till the 14th and say, oh, we missed the vernal equinox by 1 day. We got to go all the way back home and wait till the next month. No, they have to know at the beginning of the month. So they got to know at the beginning of the month if it's the first month or the 13th. They can't wait till the Passover to find out for sure. So it doesn't make sense to think that they have to wait until the 15th, until the Passover or the 14th to know that it's the first month. So you can't compare the vernal equinox with the 15th day of the month or the 14th because it's too late. You have to know at the beginning of the month to start your journey. So this is really common sense reasoning. Now, what do they have to do in order to start the trip to go to the one central place? At first, it was not Jerusalem, but after a while, during King David's reign, it became Jerusalem and remained Jerusalem from King David onwards. And Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level, so they have to go uphill quite a bit. So the interesting thing is, what do they have to prepare? Clothing for the 7 days of unleavened bread, food, exchange of goods for silver, because they're not supposed to go there empty-handed without an offering. They have to go with wagons. If they have a family, the children have to get on the wagon, and they have to put the food and the clothing and so forth, and the exchange of goods on the wagon. So they'll have to have a wagon and no doubt mules to drag the wagon all the way up to Jerusalem. And so there's travel over hilly land. And Deuteronomy 11:11 points out that Israel is a hilly land. So there's hills, and you got to go way up to Jerusalem, about 2,500 feet above sea level, with Mount Zion a few hundred feet higher than 2,500 feet. That's the high point, is Mount Zion. The whole family was ideally expected to go, and that's indicated in Exodus chapter 12, verses 25 through 27, because what it says in those verses is, when the children see what you do on the Passover, they'll ask you, what does this whole mean? That's what that sense says in Exodus 12, 25 through 20. So in order for the children to ask the question at the Passover, they have to be there. So if the children have to be there, they would have to be going on the wagon. Some of them would be very, very tiny babes. They wouldn't be able to walk that distance. So they'd be on the wagon. So you can see the practicality. You're going to have a wagon. You're going to have mules. It's going to have to go up to Jerusalem from some considerable distance, depending on what part of Israel you're in. So they must prepare and leave in advance in order to arrive for the Passover. Genesis 1:14 literally speaks of the light bearers in the heavens, not predicted lights in the heavens. We don't have to, we need to know right at the beginning of the month so there's no prediction involved. How long a time does it take for people in Israel to travel to Jerusalem for the Passover? We must consider the longest distance to travel because all of Israel was expected to go to the festival. Travel by wagon is slow because the typical beast of burden was a mule, which is very slow. People would have to walk along with the wagon, and some people would ride on the wagon. Some people could walk along with it, and some could ride on the wagon. And people average walking slowly, along with needing time to rest, to sleep, and to eat, also to relieve themselves. A large family would need time for bathroom stops for various people at different times. From Exodus 12, verses 26 and 27, we see that children were expected to be at the festival. The paths of travel would be uphill in general. It is obviously difficult to be precise on this matter of how much time it's going to take. If travel averages 2 miles an hour, and we don't know that it can even be that fast because of all the stops would be needed. If travel averages 2 miles an hour per hour, and the distance to Jerusalem is 70 miles for some locations, that would be 35 hours of travel. And that's at a good relative pace. Now, the question is how many hours of real progress can be made in one day with all the stopping needed? Probably no more than 6 hours of progress in travel per day. Dividing 35 by 6 is about 6 days at least. And one day would be the Sabbath. And they wouldn't be traveling on the Sabbath. Hence, for many people, the trip should be about a week or slightly more. Rain could cause the trip to halt for a while because the wagon could be stuck in mud if kept moving. Hence, the worst case would be more than a week. For safety in arriving before the Passover, some people would want to be cautious in case of bad weather, and hence they should seek to leave with a few extra days to spare. For some people, they would probably leave at least 10 days before the 14th day. In general, people would like to leave very close to the first day of the month. However, before they depart for the journey, they need to inspect the condition of the wagon and perhaps make some wagon repair. They would also need to pack clothing for a possible large family. They would also need to pack food provisions for the journey. From these considerations, we note that the total time for getting ready and traveling would likely require about 2 weeks. Hence, they should know whether it is the first month or the 13th month when the new crescent is sighted. I mean, they have to be there on the Passover. The slaughtering of the lamb is on the 14th. So the conclusion is that the new crescent that occurs on or after the vernal equinox begins the first month. This is all common sense from knowing that they had to be there on the 14th and that from the furthest distance, they would want to allow 2 weeks to do the travel. And so they'd have to know at the beginning of the month if it's the 1st or the 13th in order to start the travel at the beginning of the month or maybe shortly afterwards. Depending on the furthest distance you'd have to travel. And so this is really common sense reasoning. If you look at the principles of Genesis 1:14 and the fact that the vernal equinox has to be involved from these considerations of common sense, the conclusion is that the new crescent that occurs on or after the vernal equinox begins the first month. This definition for the first month is a natural result from Genesis 1:14 and a few other scriptures that relate to the year, such as Deuteronomy 12, verses 5 through 7, that points out that 3 times in the year, people are supposed to go to one central location in Israel to celebrate the place where Yahweh has placed his name. Yahweh has placed his name. The Gregorian calendar is in use around the world today. This calendar is based on the tropical year of 365.2422 days, which is the approximate time from one vernal equinox to the next vernal equinox. In this calendar, the vernal equinox falls on March 20 or 21. That's our modern Gregorian calendar. But about once every 400 years, it can fall on March 19th. Someone might propose that when the vernal equinox arrives, count each day as time progresses, close to the next vernal equinox. But you see, that's not going to be necessarily precise because it's going to be 365 or 366 days to the next vernal equinox. So you don't really know exactly on the nose which day it is. This thinking would be that the total day count should be 365 or 366 days to the next vernal equinox. But you see, there's no guarantee that it always has to be that way because that's advanced prediction. That's not allowed. We have to wait to the light trigger. And the light trigger is not counting 365 or 366. It's not the pattern of a light trigger. You're not supposed to count to find out. You're supposed to see the light trigger in the sky. In most years, this would enable a nearly accurate judgment of how to compare the 15th day of the newly beginning month to the vernal equinox. In the example discussed above, in other words, if you want to pick the 15th day on or after the vernal equinox. But it's not a guarantee. And there's nothing in scripture says you have to count the days, the 365 or 366, to know when the vernal equinox. And you wouldn't even think to do that. You wouldn't have a reason to think to do that. Scripture doesn't require you to think that way. There are two problems with this approach. The first is that there would be years in which it would be difficult to make the judgment because we would not know if the final count would be 365 or 366. The second objection is that Genesis 1:14 bases the years on the light bearers in the heavens, not on counting for the prediction. The reader might feel somewhat uncomfortable with the sequence of reasoning in this chapter that led to the conclusion that the first new crescent must be the one on the day of the vernal equinox or soon after. Now, I don't really feel uncomfortable with it, but some people might feel a little uncomfortable. The next chapter will corroborate this more precisely. So there's a more pinpointed way to know than that, even though for most purposes that would be a good way to know. Chapter 15, the adoption of the Babylonian month names. This is a very interesting chapter. And there are some people that have an aversion for Babylonian month names because the word Babylonian is there. And Babel means confusion. And so they have somehow an innate feeling in their bones, so to speak. They don't like the idea of Babylonian. But look, the fact is that the scripture is inspired. All of the scripture is inspired. And the Babylonian month names are in the scripture. So we can't dismiss that.
I used to have an aversion towards it. And part of it was also like, being a bit worried about the Catholic Church, and so when I hear the Babylonian month names, I want to stay away from it. You think about Revelation, how it seems to have bad over anything related to Babylon seems to be bad, or in the entire Bible. So when I saw, if I heard Babylonian, I automatically got kind of triggered, like, oh no. But I'm starting to realize that it, like in the Bible, it's almost like how we would call Saturday. Like if I talk to my boss, I go, hey, I can't work Saturday, it's the Sabbath, but I would say Saturday, right? Because it's just a name they know. And I'm getting the feeling that that's all they did with these Babylonian names, was do a similar thing, right?
Well, the fact of the matter, in the book of Revelation, it says, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. Babylon the Great is fallen in the book of Revelation. Now, certainly it's true, but there's a certain aspect of the Babylonian calendar that did not occur until the year 499 BC. A very interesting phenomenon, because the Babylonian calendar did not have synchronization to the vernal equinox until the year 499 BC. And it was after Israel was sent into captivity in Babylon. And it was after Daniel was appointed high up in the government of Babylon. Actually, it was really Persia. The Persians defeated Babylon, although actually that's during the book of Daniel that happened. When Daniel began to reign, it was the Babylonian Empire. It didn't become the Persian Empire until Daniel was already an old man. But it was during the reign of Daniel that the Babylonian calendar was not synchronized. During Daniel's leadership, he was appointed leadership. During that time, there was no regulation. And that's one of the reasons why in the book of Daniel, you don't have any Babylonian month names. Because during all of the years mentioned specifically in the book of Daniel, the Babylonian calendar was not synchronized to the vernal equinox. It didn't happen until afterwards. The last dated year in the book of Daniel is the year 536 BCE, 536. And it was not until 499, it's about 30 years later, that the vernal equinox became a synchronization point in the Babylonian calendar. Now, we do not have historical record as to what caused the Babylonian calendar to change in the year 499 BC. That is lost to history. We don't know. But beginning in that year, from that year onward, the first day of the first month, Nisan, in the Babylonian calendar, did not occur before the vernal equinox. There are examples in that century, beginning in 499 to 400. There are examples when the first day of a month was one day before the vernal equinox, and it was the first day of the 13th month.
Okay, so it's just in 499 it got synced up, because I was curious about this myself, because I figured that Daniel's influence might have caused the whole change in the Babylonian calendar. Maybe that change was fully caused by around 499. But you're saying, but I mean, did they have that? Was it a different calendar system all the way up until 499, or is it just like a gradual change?
Well, as far as the beginning of the month, it was identical. In other words, the Babylonian calendar began each month with the sighting of the new crescent, the same as the Jews did. So that part of the calendar was always the same as the Jewish calendar. The sighting of the new crescent began the Babylonian month. The sighting of the new crescent began the Jewish month, the biblical month. That is the same. However, in terms of which month is the first, that's where there was no regularity with the Babylonian calendar until the year 499.
Okay.
Now, I will say this, that in theory, it is possible that Daniel could have lived to the year 499. But he would have been, see, he was a teenager when he was taken captive in the year 605. He was a teenager about the year 605 when he was first taken captive into Babylon. That's the first of the three invasions. The third one was in 586 BCE when Jerusalem was destroyed. But he was among the captives in the first of the three times that Babylon invaded. And so he would, if he was still alive, he would have to have been, maybe 120, 125 years old in 499. It is possible that he could have been 125 years old. It's possible that Daniel could have been alive in 499. It's not so likely, but it's not something you can prove one way or the other. But it's possible. It is possible Daniel could have lived to be 125 or so, and then It could have been that he was alive when the Babylonian calendar became synchronized to the vernal equinox. We just don't know.
Okay.
Now, let's go on to the chapter 15, the adoption of the Babylonian month names. Introduction. The conclusion from Genesis 1:14 that the first month is the one whose first day occurs on or after the vernal equinox will now be corroborated with a historical event that has a basis from Scripture. We understand how the ancient Babylonian calendar worked because their eclipse records agree with modern computer simulation data for those eclipses. Now, it's possible to spend a half an hour discussing the whole thing here, but I can't afford that time now. It's simply going into the eclipse records, how we know what the eclipse records were, and so on and so on. There are tablets. There are clay tablets. Actually, many thousands. There's over 100,000 clay tablets have been found buried beneath the ground that are in writing from that time of the Babylonians. Over 100,000 clay tablets. And the decipherment of those clay tablets, the language, Akkadian language, was worked out in a 30-year period from about 1840 to 1870. And once that was done, they began to understand these clay tablets, thousands of them, many of them in the British Museum. And that enabled people to finally figure out how the Babylonian calendar worked because of the eclipse records that were part of the records, the historical records on those clay tablets. And so there's nearly 200 computer records of eclipses. Let me continue here. It is necessary to have the Babylonian king lists with the length of their reign. This was known from Claudius Ptolemy about the year 150 CE. The eclipses were recorded with the year of the king's reign, the month number, and the day of the month. There are nearly 200 eclipse records from ancient Babylon preserved on clay tablets between the years 747 BCE and the 1st century BCE. Most of them also have time during the night of the eclipse sightings based on their water clocks. Using computers and mathematical astronomy to compute the time of those eclipses that were time-stamped by the ancient astronomers, that is time-stamped by the water clocks, we know how the ancient Babylonian calendar worked, and we are even able to approximate the accuracy of their water clocks. The average accuracy of the water clocks for timing the eclipses was 8 minutes. Temperature affects the rate of water dripping. The eclipse records of the Babylonians are what enable accurate dating of certain historical events from 747 BCE onward into the 1st century BCE. In other words, when you have Bibles and the Bibles date certain things after the year 747, the reason why we're able to do that is because of the eclipse records and dating things. It makes it precise. When Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, the skilled residents of Jerusalem were taken into exile between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In Jeremiah 29, verses 1 through 14, we note that Jeremiah commanded the Jews who were exiled in Babylonia to be peaceful and productive in Babylonia. And then later, Yahweh would cause some of them to return to Jerusalem. See, and that's because they were peaceful and productive. It was like a reward for being so peaceful and productive. We'll let you return to Jerusalem. There were multiple stages in time during which some of these exiles returned to Jerusalem, as recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, now part B of this chapter 15. Babylonian month names in Ezra and Nehemiah. Certain events in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are dated using Babylonian month names in matters that specifically pertain to the Jews. When the Jews mentioned the day of the month in their own calendar using the same month names as the Babylonians in their calendar, their dates must have almost always been the same. Otherwise, there would be much confusion in dates among the Jews compared to the society around them. And thus, the Jews would not have wanted to use those month names in their calendar. In other words, can you imagine Babylonians using the month name Nisan, the Jews using the month name Nisan, and if they didn't line up to be the same month, there would be confusion. They wouldn't even want to use that month name Nisan unless it was the same month. And we know they began the month the same way with the sighting of the new moon. By examining the month names and the context, we can note the adoption of these month names into the calendar of the Jews. The Aramaic first month in the Babylonian calendar is named Nisanu, but the later Jewish transliteration into Hebrew dropped the final vowel, making it Nisan. And it's a similar for the other month names. There's in the Aramaic language, which was the language of Babylon, many of the nouns ended in a vowel sound. That was not true in Hebrew, but it was true in Aramaic. And so, but in the Hebrew, they would drop the final vowel sound, and that's how Nisanu became Nisan. And similar with other names of the months. For simplicity, we use the same spelling for both when it's necessary to talk about the month. The eclipse records of the Babylonians enable us to know that beginning with the year 499 BCE, Nisan 1 in the Babylonian calendar occurred on or soon after the vernal equinox, never before. Never before. This agrees with the reasoning from the last chapter. In other words, the last chapter we used common sense reasoning to pinpoint the vernal equinox, that in order to get there in time for the Passover sacrifice, they would have to want to leave about 2 weeks in advance, which is when the first day of that month occurred. And they'd have to have the light trigger occur on that time when they would start to leave. And so that's common sense. But this is pinpointing it with a different way, by the adoption of the Babylonian month name Nisan, and the fact that beginning with 499 BC, from that point onwards, the Babylonian calendar never allowed the first day of Nisan to come before the vernal equinox. And in that century of Ezra and Nehemiah, in that century, there were 5 times when Nisan 1 occurred exactly on the day of the vernal equinox. And in all 5 times, that became the first day of the first month in the Babylonian calendar. And so it proves that the Babylonian calendar in that century in which Ezra and Nehemiah lived, the calendar became regularized to the vernal equinox. And the pattern was established of on or after the vernal equinox during that century when Ezra and Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem. So when they were finally there in Jerusalem, that pattern had been well established for several decades. The Aaronic priesthood that was restored in Jerusalem under the leadership of Ezra kept the calendar correctly from the days of Ezra and Nehemiah until the first century, as indicated in Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 2 through 9, and Luke chapter 2, verses 41 and 42. See, we earlier in this document, we read Luke 2, verses 41 and 42, pointing out how Yeshua's parents, every year at the Passover, they went to keep the festival in Jerusalem. And that's where the priesthood presided. And that priesthood continued the pattern from the book of Ezra onward into the first century. We already discussed Psalm 133, showing that the Aaronic priesthood had the responsibility for the unity of the people. They had the authority to maintain the calendar, to blow the two silver trumpets. And so we see that the priesthood carried on the calendar from the days of Ezra and Nehemiah into the first century, to the point where Yeshua, who never sinned, was in fact with his parents on the Passover, that the calendar was correct in the first century. And since Ezra and Nehemiah were using the Babylonian month name Nisan, that pattern would continue using the vernal equinox into the first century. In the context of Jerusalem, in Ezra 6:15, there is mention of the month named Adar, without mentioning that it is the 12th month using the Babylonian month name. In other words, when you read Ezra 6:15, it's expected that you, as the reader, would see the word Adar and you would automatically know that it had to be the 12th month. So the scripture expects you to know the month number by just seeing the name. It doesn't say it's the 12th month, but it is the 12th month. You can actually tell that from the book of Esther, but it doesn't repeat it in the book of Ezra. In the context of Jerusalem in Nehemiah 6:15, and it's interesting, it happened to be same chapter and verse number in two different books, just the way it comes out. In the context of Jerusalem in Nehemiah 6:15, there is mention of the month named Elul, without mentioning that it is the 6th month using the Babylonian month name. But then again, it doesn't have the number 6 in that verse, but it expects the reader to know, oh, you see Elul, you know automatically it's got to be the 6th month. So it shows how the Bible takes it for granted that by knowing the name, you know the month number. And it was adopted from the Babylonian calendar. And it was regularized according to the vernal equinox at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Next page, next slide. In the context of Persia, in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, there is mention of the month named Kislev, without mentioning that it is the 9th month using the Babylonian month name. So the same thing is true about Kislev. In the context of Persia, in Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 1, there is mention of the month named Nisan, without mentioning that it is the 1st month using the Babylonian month name. We see that in Nehemiah, both in the context of Persia as well as in the context of Jerusalem, that Babylonian month names are used without mentioning the number of the month. The reader is expected to know that the month number, what the month number is from its name. There's no reason to imagine that the month name meant something different in the context of Persia compared to Jerusalem. From 499 BC onward, until the Babylonian calendar's last recorded year of 75 in the 1st century, its first day of the 1st month Nisan did not begin before the vernal equinox. And there are examples when it did begin exactly on the day of the vernal equinox. During the century from 499 to 400 BCE, Nisan 1 of the Babylonian calendar fell on the day of the vernal equinox 5 times. Prior to the year 499 BCE, the Babylonian calendar did allow the beginning of the 1st month, Nisan, to swing erratically on either side of the vernal equinox. Ezra traveled to Jerusalem in 457 BCE. Nehemiah traveled to Jerusalem in 444 BCE. These books might have been written a little after the last date in these books, and this could possibly affect how the writers decided to write the month names. See, we don't know that. We're just looking at what we know. In the year 539 BCE, Persia defeated the Babylonian Empire and adopted the Babylonian calendar, although they did not prevent local calendars from continuing to exist. For example, the local Persian calendar, that's the Zoroastrian religious calendar, still continued. And the Egyptian civil calendar also continued. Both the Babylonian calendar and the Egyptian civil calendar, thus using two calendars simultaneously. See, the Persian Empire allowed people that were in that empire to use whatever calendar they wanted to. But they did adopt the Babylonian calendar also when they conquered Babylon. Now we're going to read Nehemiah 5:14, or part of it. Yeah. It says Nehemiah shows that Nehemiah was appointed governor of Judah under the Persian king Artaxerxes. Judah was part of the Persian Empire, not a fully independent nation. Yet in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 30, the words of Nehemiah are, quote, "Thus I purified them," them refers to the people in Judah, "from everything foreign," unquote. Now, it's an interesting thing that Nehemiah purified them from everything foreign, but he used the Babylonian month name in the book of Nehemiah. And so he didn't feel that doing that was foreign because the calendar was essentially the same. They began with the vernal equinox, and they began the month with the sighting of the new moon. So it's an interesting thing. He says, "I purified the people from everything foreign," meaning that they used the right calendar. They didn't use a foreign calendar. Nehemiah had the authority to keep the religion pure, even though Judah was part of the Persian Empire. Persia allowed the different peoples within its empire to keep their own religion. Okay, part C. Babylonian month names in Esther. Now evidence is presented from the book of Esther showing that the month names of the Babylonian calendar were used by both the Babylonians and the Jews, with the expectation that their timing was the same for both almost always at that time in history. The entire setting of Esther is the Persian capital city of Susa, called Shushan in Hebrew. The king is named Ahasuerus, as typically transliterated. On page 54 of this particular book, Williamson, in 1985, we find the following concerning the name Ahasuerus. Quote, from Old Persian Kahasrasha, it occurs in this document called Aram P as Kasherash, chapter 2, verse 1 in that document, and Sharish, chapter 5, verse 1, thus making the identity with Xerxes certain. In other words, that was a way of writing Xerxes' name in those documents. And so we see that this name in the Hebrew, Ahasuerus, is actually Xerxes. The reign of Xerxes is from 485 to 465 BCE. The last dated year written in Esther is the 12th year in Esther chapter 3, verse 17, which is 474 BCE. The book of Esther may have been committed to writing some years after this. The book of Esther has Babylonian month names in 10 places. I've written down all 10 places where there are Babylonian month names in the book of Esther. Now notice Esther chapter 9, verses 20-21. I'm going to quote from the New American Standard Bible. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far. This would include Judah, because Judah was one of the provinces of the Persian Empire, and obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually, unquote. So this is for the Feast of Purim. Esther chapter 9, verses 26 through 32 shows this to be the origin of the Jewish festival of Purim, to be kept by all Jews from that time onward. And Jews today also keep the Feast of Purim on the 14th and 15th days, but of course, according to the modern calculated Jewish calendar. But they were supposed to do that. And it says in the book of Esther, in the month of Adar. So, and the month of Adar is still being used for the 12th month of the Jewish calendar. So they kept the month names the same from that time of Ezra and Nehemiah on to today, even though the Babylonian calendar itself stopped being used in the year 75 in the first century. This shows that all of the Jews in all of the Persian Empire, including those in Jerusalem, would know the same month Adar in which to keep the festival Purim. If there was often a time difference between the month with a name in the Babylonian Persian calendar and the month with the same name in the Jewish calendar, then within the same empire, that would cause much confusion. Okay, now part D. Part D is Babylonian month names in Zechariah. See, there are 4 books that use Babylonian month names: Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Zechariah. And that's why we're mentioning these particular 4 books of the Bible. I believe that in order that we would understand the calendar today, that those historical records of the eclipses and the biblical month names were there in these 4 books, so we'd be able to figure out the calendar. Without the eclipse records and without all of the, and pinpointing even to the point we can tell that the Babylonian water clocks averaged being 8 minutes wrong in the time of the eclipses. We can pinpoint almost 200 eclipses, even to where the water clocks show it to within 8 minutes of the eclipse, using modern astronomy and mathematics, going all the way back to verify those eclipse records that are found in the British Museum. It shows we know exactly how the calendar worked, and the Babylonians were able to date all these events. Anyway, let's look at part D, Babylonian month names in Zechariah. Without all of that information, we would not be able to know the Babylonian calendar, and we wouldn't have the pinpointing of the vernal equinox. It's amazing that the Bible gives us enough information to pinpoint the vernal equinox exactly to the day using those records. People wrote that. They didn't know that we were going to figure that out 2,000 years later, but that's the way it is. It says in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4, in the latter days, people will run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. And this is the knowledge of how the Babylonian calendar worked in the latter days. We were not able to interpret those tablets until the language was deciphered between 1840 and 1870. That's how recent we were able to pinpoint all this information. Part D. All Babylonian month dates in Zechariah show a King Darius. If Darius the first is the king, his reign is from 521 to 486 BCE. So his second year is 520 BCE. If Darius II is the king, and it doesn't identify which Darius. If Darius II is the king, his reign is 423 to 405 BCE. And his second year is 422 BCE. Now, this is a weird thing. I'm pointing out, I'm not being prejudiced here, I'm just pointing out on page 162 of this book by Becking in 2022, he wrote, quote, a reference to Darius II is, in my opinion, that's Becking's opinion. It's not the opinion of most scholars. But you see, one of the things that I have spent a little time looking into is trying to date and pinpoint which king ruled and so forth. And There are chronological problems in trying to identify things precisely in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's not something that I figured out, and scholars debate that. And Becking is one of the scholars that debate that. Becking thinks that it was Darius too, even though most Bible chronology books say it was Darius the first. And I'm not taking sides. I don't know if it's Darius 1 or Darius 2. But this is what Becking wrote. Quote, a reference to Darius 2 is, in my view, more likely. Yeah. Most sources assume Darius 1. The final written version of Zechariah may have been penned later than the events stated in it. So we don't know that. In Zechariah chapter 1, verse 7, this is in the New King James Version, on the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month Shabbat, in the second year of Darius. Zechariah chapter 7, verse 1, mentions the fourth year of King Darius, the fourth day of the ninth month, Kislev. Thus, two dates have Babylonian month names along with the number of the month. Zechariah chapter 4, verse 9. The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple. His hands shall also finish it. Ezra tells us a little more about Zechariah and the completion of the temple. In Ezra chapter 6, verse 14, it says, and the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah son of Edu. They built and finished it by the command of the Almighty of Israel and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. It's interesting, Darius is mentioned here too, but it doesn't say Darius 1 or Darius 2. Ezra 6:15, and this house was finished on the third day of the month Adar, which is the sixth year of the reign of Darius, the king. This is 516 BCE if Darius the first, or 418 BCE if Darius the second. Artaxerxes the first reigned from 464 to 424, 464 to 424 BCE, and Zechariah 4 verse 9 with Ezra 4:15 implies Zechariah was active in or after the reign of Artaxerxes the first. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in all this. I'm just summarizing. The book of Ezra cannot run chronologically from beginning to end. There is a possible case for the writing of Zechariah during the reign of Darius II. What I'm simply doing here is pointing out that there is some uncertainty whether Darius I or Darius II is meant. And for that reason, we can't be perfectly accurate of when the dating of the book of Zechariah was. Let's go on to part E. The overall conclusion from the evidence of the Babylonian month names as seen in the Tanakh, the word Tanakh means the Hebrew Bible, is that the calendar used by the Aaronic priesthood in Jerusalem after the return from exile is that the first month Nisan begins with the day of the sighting of the new crescent that occurs on or first after the vernal equinox, with the understanding that the first day of Nisan is not declared until the two silver trumpets are blown by the priests in accordance with Numbers chapter 10, verse 10. The declaration occurs during the same daytime that the observation for the vernal equinox takes place. In other words, the vernal equinox is seen, I'm going to just give an aside here, it's seen by a straight line, the only days of the year in which the sun, from the point of the vertical object that's fixed, hits the ground. All day long, that shadow of the top of that object is a straight line only on the days of the vernal equinox, no other days. So it's easy for ancient people to pinpoint the day of the vernal equinox by looking at that straight line pattern, only on falls straight line on 2 days, The day before it's crooked, it's bent. The day afterward, it's bent in the opposite direction. But only on the vernal equinoxes is it a perfectly straight line all day long, as well as both the equinoxes. On both the equinoxes, the shadow of the sun cast on the ground from a vertical fixed object is a straight line only on those 2 days. So it's very, very easy to determine the vernal equinox. No calculation. So that's how you determine it. And furthermore, it is the same at the equator as it is in New York and Philadelphia and Jerusalem. The straight line definition is the same regardless of the latitude. All the way up to Canada and all the way down to the end of South America, that straight line is the same to the vernal equinox. Same time. And so they can pinpoint it all through. They can pinpoint the vernal equinox on the same day. Chapter 16. The Passover letter shows the Jerusalem Nisan was the Babylonian Nisan. Now, this is a very, very interesting thing because you can actually corroborate that the Jews that were living in Jerusalem used the same month name as the Babylonian calendar from this letter called the Passover letter. Very, very unusual thing that this was preserved for about 2,500 years. In southern Egypt, the Persian Empire controlled the city of Syene, which is modern-day Aswan, and the military base on the island of Elephantine, where about 100 ancient documents have been discovered with events dated in both the Egyptian civil calendar and the Babylonian calendar. Before the year 1990, there was a debate within the scholarly community concerning whether these documents, nearly 100 documents, were dated using the Jewish calendar. Got to get the cursor to move to the next page. Here we go. Concerning whether the documents used the Jewish calendar from Jerusalem or the Babylonian calendar dictated from the temple in the city of Babylon. However, since 1990, the 1990 paper by Bezalel Porten was published, we have solid grounds for scholarly acceptance that the whole region was under the command of Persian leadership. The reason for the scholarly debate was that there were many Jewish mercenaries who worked for the Persians while they lived on the island of Elephantine. See, the Persian government paid certain Jewish soldiers to guard the southern boundary of Egypt on the island of Elephantine. And the documents were dated with 2 calendar dates for the same day. One calendar date was the Babylonian calendar, and the other date was the Egyptian calendar. And it's one of the things that helps us to date the Egyptian civil calendar. One of the Aramaic letters found buried, and it hardly ever rains up there. It rains so sparsely that when they dug that up, they were actually able to get the documents that were written, about 100 documents that were written from about 2,500 years ago. It's amazing that the documents were preserved in the dry ground over there. One of the Aramaic letters found buried at Elephantine is known in scholarly circles today as the Passover Papyrus. The Hebrew Aramaic alphabetic characters in this letter, along with an English translation, are found on pages 56 and 57 of this book by Lindenberger, published in 1994. And again, as I mentioned in the previous part 1, these references are all documented in the book Barley and Calendar that's available as a free download from the website biblicalcalendar.org. And so if you look at that document at the end in the bibliography, you'll see the full title and author and so forth, Lindenberger in 1994. In the following quotations from the letter, the square brackets and the contents within them appear on page 57 of Lindenberger. Now, the reason why he has to add something in square brackets is that because the document is 2,500 years old, there are some bits of the papyrus that were worn away and missing. And so he adds in square brackets what he thinks would have been in the original by looking at the context. That's why the square brackets added. Okay, the letter contains, quote, this year, year 5 of King Darius, which dates the letter in 419, 418 BCE. That would imply it's King Darius II to this particular letter. There are gaps. There are gaps in the letter because it's poorly preserved. The addressing of the letter says, quote, to my brothers Yedaniah and his colleagues, the Jewish garrison, from your brother Hananiah. In other words, the Jewish garrison, they were the people that were paid mercenaries on the island of Elephantine. And Hananiah is the person from Jerusalem that's writing the letter to the garrison of troops on the island of Elephantine. It was written from one Jew in friendship to the Jews on the island with whom the author had familiarity. Part of the preserved text of the letter says, quote, be scrupulously pure. Do not do any work. Do not drink any nor eat anything leavened at sunset until the 21st of Nisan, unquote. Another translation of the same segment of this letter is on page 283 of Witter's. It's another book published in 2001. He also discusses the letter, and he also has a translation where he adds in square brackets some guesses and gaps in the text as follows. Quote, be pure and take heed. Do no work on the 15th and on the 21st day, nor drink fermented drink, nor eat anything in which there is leaven, from the 14th at sundown until the 21st of Nis, unquote. Note that the final letter of Nisan is missing in this poorly preserved papyrus, so only Nis is shown. In other words, he is trying to be scrupulous and trying to pinpoint in the translation exactly where he adds square brackets and fills it in, and as far as the letter goes there. And it only has Nis and leaves off the final nun, the letter nun, because it's missing in the document. The final letter nun in Nisan is missing. This provides let's see now. Okay, this provides, and here we go, historical evidence that after the return from exile under Ezra and Nehemiah, Jews named the first month Nisan as a substitute for the word Aviv. That's interesting, because in this letter from Jerusalem to the Jews living in the island of Elephantine, they used the word Nisan instead of Aviv to designate the first month. On page 283 of Witter's 1991, he comments, quote, the letter came from one Hananiah who apparently wanted the Jews in Egypt to celebrate Passover and unleavened bread appropriately. The address and greeting rule out a local Egyptian official or Persian overlord, unquote. If the name Nisan was not significant for the first month to the Jews, the letter could simply have said the first month or use an expression with Aviv, Hebrew Aviv, to signify the first month. This should be accepted as ancient historical evidence that outside the Tanakh, that's the Hebrew Bible, that Jews of the 5th century BCE considered the Babylonian month name Nisanu as equivalent to the first month of their year. In other words, we actually have written evidence outside the Bible, preserved from about 2,500 years ago, that somebody in Jerusalem used that name Nisan to refer to the same month as the Babylonian edition that the Jews were using there, using the Babylonian calendar on the island of Elephantine. It's about 600 miles away from Jerusalem that they lived. There was a distance of over 570 miles from Jerusalem to the island of Elephantine, and it was all uphill, but not steep. From along the Nile River, if you went along the Nile River, it's about 570 miles. On the northern coast to Elephantine. It would not be feasible that this letter would get from Jerusalem to Elephantine in time for any report about the condition of barley in Israel. That's an interesting point, because in order to travel that distance, all the way up to Syene from Jerusalem, it wouldn't make any sense that they can give a barley report to indicate anything about starting a month using barley at Elephantine. They wouldn't even know soon enough to let them know the state of the barley, considering how long it would take for the letter to get up there. And to report the condition of barley, nothing in the letter mentions barley or Aviv. Mentions Nisan for the first month. Okay, chapter 17.
I think that was a pretty good point, man, because I mean, I never even thought of that point myself about how long a letter would take to travel. Not just that these people have to travel there, but you have to report the condition of the barley. If you were to go by the barley, you would have to report that soon enough for that letter to also get there. Then for the people to travel there, so you're talking at least 1 week to travel there, and 1 week for the 1 week for the letter to travel there, and then those people still need at least 10 days, because like you said, they got to check the wagons, they got to prepare everything, not to mention the travel time. So I thought that's an awesome point. I just want to stress that.
Well, the point that I'm making here is that the letter was sent from somebody in Jerusalem to get up to the mercenaries up there. And so they had to send the letter soon enough to reach them before Passover. And so the time for the letter to get there would have been so long that they couldn't have known the state of the barley at that point in time. It would have been much longer than the first month would begin in order for the letter to get there in that amount of time. That's why I say that the state of the barley would have been not known sufficiently early for them to know what the state was by the time the letter would get there.
Right. Then you add the travel time and the preparation on top of that for them to, once they do get that letter, to try to travel. It's
if any of them would want to do that, because they're paid mercenaries, so probably they wouldn't even want to come.
Okay.
But the main point was for the travel time from Jerusalem to get up to those people on the island of Elephantine. That's the travel time would be longer than the 14 days just to get there from the beginning of the month to get up to the island of Elephantine. That's what I believe. That's 570 miles. What we estimated time travel just to get from 70 miles to Jerusalem. This is 570 miles. So that's why I'm saying that it's unthinkable that the state of the barley could have been known at the time the letter was first sent to reach the Jews up there. That's the point that I'm making.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay. Chapter 17, Philo of Alexandria and the Vernal Equinox. Now, I am not making any claim that Philo of Alexandria is in any way infallible. I'm not trying to say that he's scripture. I'm not trying to put it in that term. But it's in order to understand something of the culture of the first century. Because Philo of Alexandria, he was born about 20 BCE. He died about the year 50 BCE. No, he died 50, not BCE, but CE. That's a mistake. I have to correct the spelling mistake that I made over here, because he died in the year 50 CE, not BCE. that would make it that he died before he was born if it was BCE. So that's wrong. I got to correct this mistake in the document over here. It's 50 CE, 50 CE, 50 of the first century. In other words, he lived about 70 years. Born about 20 before BCE and died about 70 years later. I got rid of the B in the BCE. Okay. He lived within a wealthy Jewish family that enabled the best education that one may desire. He was very wealthy. He was well educated in the Greek tradition of Alexandria, the leading city of scientific achievement in that era. Although active Babylonian astronomy did not fade away until the year 75 CE. Philo wrote extensively about biblical matters and philosophy from a Jewish viewpoint, yet he injected some Greek philosophy as though it was part of Judaism. While pointing out that he was not infallible, he studied Greek philosophy and he embedded some Greek philosophy in his commentary having to do with Judaism. Philo represented mainstream Judaism in Alexandria. See, there was a certain time at which, about the year 38, that a delegation was sent to Rome by the Jews that lived in Alexandria. And he was part of the delegation that represented the Jews in Alexandria going to Rome. And he wrote about that in one of his books, Philo of Alexandria did. And so the fact that he represented the Jews in going to Rome shows that he was part of mainstream Judaism. He wouldn't have been picked to represent the Jews in Alexandria going to Rome unless he was part of mainstream Judaism. His Bible was the Greek Septuagint, and he did not know Hebrew according to today's scholars. There are many reasons why people look at the writings of Philo to show that he did not know Hebrew. He accepted the Septuagint as inspired as a translation from the Hebrew, thinking that it was perfectly accurate, even though it wasn't in some places. In Genesis 1:14, where the Hebrew text has the plural of moed, which is typically translated seasons or festivals or appointed times, literally it's appointed times. The Septuagint has the Greek word kairos, Strong's number 2540 in the Greek. The various versions of the Jewish Aramaic paraphrase translations of the Bible, known as the Aramaic Targums, all interpret moed to include the meaning festivals. The Jewish commentaries of the Middle Ages also agree with this understanding of moed, that it means festivals. In Leviticus 23, the Hebrew word moed occurs 6 times. And it's Leviticus 23, and these are the verses, the 6 verses that have the word moed. The association of moed with festivals is clear from its use in Leviticus 23, as well as Psalm 104, verse 19. And that verse says, the moon is used for the appointed times. And elsewhere, in the Tanakh, the use of moed is only associated with the festivals when restricted to contexts that involve the cycles of the heavenly lights. In contrast to this, kairos occurs in Leviticus 23, verse 4, but nowhere else. Let me go back to see the ending of that verse. But nowhere else in the Septuagint of Leviticus 23. In other words, the word kairos is a Greek word that has a very general word for time. It does not coincide exactly with the word moed in the Hebrew. In Greek, kairos is a very general word for time, and it is not noted for being associated with the festivals or any other regular repetitive time. Thus, one would not particularly expect Philo to interpret Kairos as festivals. And indeed, Philo does not interpret festivals, does not interpret the word Kairos that way. However, he does use the word Kairos in discussing this portion of Genesis 1:14, indicating that in this version of the Septuagint that is Philo is using, Genesis 1:14 is similar to the Septuagint that is commonly available to us. See, we don't have a first century Septuagint. The oldest Septuagint we have in writing dates from about the year 350 CE, 350 AD. We don't have any Septuagint in full before the year 350 CE. So we don't have Philo's Septuagint. We have Philo himself, and he used a version of the Septuagint, but we do not have the specific version of the Septuagint that Philo himself used, because we don't have any first century Septuagint available. Philo discusses Genesis 1, verses 14 through 16 on pages 34 and 40 to 47 of Philo, Volume 1, On the Creation. That's his work, Philo's On the Creation. On pages 44, 45, on paragraph 59, Philo wrote, this is Philo now quoting in translation, by appointed times, Kairos is the Greek word there. Moses understood the 4 seasons of the year, and surely with good reason, unquote. So Philo, when he saw the word Kairos, where the Hebrew has the word moed, he interpreted it in his paraphrase, but he only had the Greek, he didn't have the Hebrew. He interpreted as seasons, as summer, fall, winter, spring. And so Philo understood that as meaning summer, fall, winter, or spring when he saw the word Kairos in Genesis 1:14. It's a little humorous that Philo puts this interpretation in Moses' mind, because he said Moses understood the 4 seasons of the year. So it's a little humorous that Philo puts this interpretation in Moses' mind, as if to say this is what Moses knew it to mean, rather than this is Philo's interpretation. Since the 4 seasons are bounded by the equinoxes and solstices, he certainly believes that Genesis 1:14 includes these astronomical events. On pages 46 and 47, paragraph 60, Philo continues, quote, the heavenly bodies were created also to furnish measures of time, for it is by regular revolutions of sun, moon, and the other bodies that days and months and years were constituted, unquote. So he points to the heavenly bodies as the months and years were constituted. Now, notice he leaves out barley. He uses heavenly bodies to determine months and years. He does not say anything about barley over here. Since the calendar is based on these units, and he declares these units to be based on measures of time of the heavenly bodies, he leaves no place for the barley to be the determining factor for the first month. The reader might be curious about why Philo wrote here, and other bodies. While we know that the Greek astronomer Hipparchus proved that the stars drift very slowly from the equinoxes, and he discovered this about 100 years before Philo was born, this knowledge had not been popularized and accepted, so that Philo does not know this. Thus, Philo implies that the thought that the cycle of the appearance are bounded by the equinoxes and solstices. He certainly believes that Genesis 1:14 includes these astronomical events. On pages 46, 47, paragraph 60, Philo continues, and this is a quote from Philo. The heavenly bodies were created also to furnish measures of time, for it is by regular revolutions of sun, moon, and the other bodies that days and months and years were constituted, unquote. Since the calendar is based on these units, and he declares these units to be based on measures of time of the heavenly bodies, he leaves no place for the barley to be the determining factor for the first month. The reader might be curious about why Philo wrote here, and the other bodies. While we know that the Greek astronomer Hipparchus proved that the stars drift very slowly from the equinoxes, I already read this, and he discovered this about 100 years before Philo was born. This knowledge had not yet been popularized and accepted, so Philo does not know this. Philo implies that the thought of the cycle of the appearance of the stars agrees with the sun's sign of equinoxes and solstices that make the seasons. If Philo had been familiar with the Hebrew text of Genesis 1:14, he would not have made the association of the Greek kairos with the Hebrew moed, and then would have linked this to the festivals using the context of moed in Leviticus 23. Instead of linking kairos to the festivals, he links it to the four seasons, indicating the equinoxes and solstices. Philo wrote on page 151 of Philo, Volume 7, Special Laws 1.90. Who else could have shown us nights and days and months and years and time in general, except, notice he says, who else could have shown us these things except the revolutions, harmonious and grand beyond all description of the sun and the moon and the other stars, quote unquote. Notice that the way Philo asks the question emphatically shows that agriculture is not the way to determine years and the first month. Again, Philo leaves no place for the use of barley in calendric determinations. 3 different places he said this type of thing. If on an annual basis, the Jews in Alexandria had to wait for a report on the state of barley from the priests in Judea in order to know when to leave for a journey to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread at the Temple in Jerusalem, Philo would not accept such an important annual event in its role to determine the time of the first month. In this matter, Philo's Bible, the Septuagint, has no distortion that would give Philo a reason to have a prejudice against the use of barley. But he surely knows nothing of the role of barley in the early first century to determine the first month. Having examined Genesis 1:14 in Philo's writings, the next step is to consider his comments on Exodus chapter 12 and verse 2. In order to properly evaluate this, the reader should know that the Alexandrian astronomers accepted the zodiac from the Babylonians who invented it. The zodiac divided the year into 12 equal parts, called signs of the zodiac, and they gave each sign a name that was associated with a constellation of stars in the sky at the time of its invention in the middle of the 5th month, BCE, 5th century BCE. The Greeks named the first sign of the zodiac Crino, which means the ram. The Latin word for ram is Aries. In most sources, the first sign of the zodiac is called Aries. They use the Latin name instead of the Greek name. The Greek astronomers in Alexandria began Aries with the vernal equinox, but the Babylonians began Aries at a different day with respect to the vernal equinox. Now, that statement that the Greek astronomers in Alexandria began Aries with the day of the vernal equinox, but the Babylonians did not do that. That's part of the reason why Pliny the Elder, in the 1st century, writing from Rome, did not use the first day of Aries as beginning with the vernal equinox. So there was a difference between the Aries in Rome with the Aries in Alexandria, Egypt. It didn't mean the same thing in Rome that it did there. And that's one of the reasons people misunderstand Josephus, because Josephus uses the term Aries And some people imagine incorrectly that Josephus is using the same meaning for Aries as they used in Alexandria, but he was not. I don't want to get into that. I shouldn't even have mentioned it.
Oh, I think it was an interesting and important point. I'm glad you did briefly mention it. So,
well, in a different document that I wrote that's available on the website, biblicalcalendar.org, I go into the later history that shows how, in multiple ways, the Christians in Alexandria misinterpreted Josephus. And this is one of the reasons, because they thought that Josephus was using the word Aries in the same sense that they were using it in Alexandria, but they were not. So they misinterpreted Josephus for this reason, as well as for other reasons. But anyway, let's continue here. The science writer Pliny the Elder, who wrote in Latin for the Romans, began the sign of Aries when the Babylonians began it, thus differing with the Greeks in Alexandria. When Josephus wrote his works for the Roman nobles, he used Pliny the Elder for his understanding of the beginning of Aries. Thus, Philo of Alexandria differed with Josephus on the meaning of Aries. Philo was well educated, but not in the area of mathematical astronomy. See the last two words again. The zodiac was popular in areas where Greek culture had spread. It should be accepted that people in Alexandria would understand that the first day of Aries was the day of the vernal equinox, as taught by the astronomers in Alexandria, which was unlike most of the Roman Empire in the first century, where the eighth day of Aries was taken as the day of the vernal equinox, in agreement with the Babylonians. Philo discusses Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, on pages 2 through 5 of Philo, Question and Answers on Exodus, book 1.1. On page 2, he wrote, so this is a translation of Philo of Exodus chapter 12 and verse 2. Quote, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months, is the first of the months of the year. Scripture thinks it proper to reckon the cycle of months from the vernal equinox. From the vernal equinox. Proper to reckon the cycle of months from the vernal equinox." So Philo is actually a witness, actually using the word in Greek for vernal equinox here. Moreover, this month is said to be the first and the beginning by synonymy, since these terms are explained by each other. For it is said to be the first in order and in power. Similarly, that time which proceeds from the vernal equinox also appears as the beginning, both in order and in power, in the same way as the head is the beginning of a living creature. And thus, those who are learned in astronomy, and notice he doesn't include himself here, because he says those learned in astronomy. He's not included. He doesn't understand astronomy that well. And thus, for those who are learned in astronomy, writes Philo, has given this name, the Ram. The Ram is the Aries, the beginning with the day of the vernal equinox, as the astronomers in Alexandria used it, to the aforementioned time, the vernal equinox. See, the Ram, which is Aries in Greek, it means krino. Krino means ram, as Aries means ram in Latin. And so, from Philo's viewpoint, using the Greek, it's the ram that he calls the first sign of the zodiac. And it begins with the day of the vernal equinox. To the before mentioned time. The before mentioned time was the vernal equinox. He said vernal equinox. For they, astronomers, call the ram the head of the zodiac, since in it the sun appears to produce the vernal equinox. That's right, it's the beginning of the ram. Then on page 3, he wrote, and that scripture presupposes the vernal equinox to be the beginning cycle of months. Now I'm going to read this again, and I'll put this in bold for a very special reason. I'm going to comment on this verse. This is in Philo. Quote, and that scripture presupposes the vernal equinox to be the beginning of the cycle of months is clear from the notions of time held in the ordinance and traditions of various nations. Now, notice the vernal equinox to be the beginning of the cycle of months. That's a very important thing. Elsewhere, Philo made it clear that the Jewish months begin with the sighting of the new crescent. The reader is therefore expected to know that he's speaking about a lunar calendar in Scripture. We know that on page 391, of this book by Alan E. Samuel, published in 1988, quote, in the areas of Syria and the East, controlled by the Seleucid kings, Macedonian calendar was adjusted to make its months coincide with the months of the Babylonian calendar, which was in turn regulated locally by a 19-year cycle. The system was in general use in the East, and East meaning where Babylon was located, the east of the Mediterranean Sea, and persisted in an adjusted form in cities all over the eastern regions well into the period of Roman domination, unquote. When Philo speaks of the traditions of various nations, from Staniel's statement, he is referring to the continuation of the Babylonian calendar, whose first month did not begin before the day of the vernal equinox. This is the only place where Philo makes a statement about the first month that is capable of some explicit comparison with the vernal equinox. In Philo, Volume 6, The Life of Moses, paragraph 222 on page 559, we read, and here's a very, very interesting statement from Philo. Moses dates the first month of the year's revolution at the beginning of the spring equinox. Now, this to our mind does not make sense. I'm going to read this again to explain why it doesn't make sense. Moses dates the first month of the year's revolution, that is Nisan, Aviv, whichever way you want to call it, the first month of the year's revolution, at the beginning of the vernal equinox. What does that mean in the beginning of the vernal equinox? The vernal equinox is a single point in time. It's a single day. It begins a year. It's the first point of Aries. So what does he mean? Moses dates the first month of the year's revolution at the beginning of the vernal equinox. The vernal equinox is one day. What does it mean, the beginning of the vernal equinox? That's what's a significant thing here. He dates the first month of the year's revolution at the beginning of the spring equinox. The most interesting aspect of this quotation is the word beginning. The spring equinox is a brief time, either a moment or a day. The word beginning implies that in this context, the spring equinox is more than a day for it to have a beginning. It is most sensible to think that Philo is using the word for spring equinox in the sense of the season that begins with the spring equinox. The use of the word beginning implies that the first month is placed at the beginning of the spring equinox, the spring season. That's what it implies, that the first month begins at the beginning of the spring season. That's what he's implying here. Okay, chapter 18 is a review. It's a summary of evidence that favors specific use of the vernal equinox. Number 1, Genesis 1, verses 14 through 18, with Exodus 34:22 and Jeremiah 36:22. We went through all of these. Were explained to show that a light trigger from a heavenly light determines the beginning of the year. and specifically, the light trigger is the vernal equinox. The new crescent on or after the day of the vernal equinox begins the first month of the year using Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 5 through 7, one place that Yahweh places his name, and the needed time to arrive there, to be there for Passover, the time travel, the distance needed. That's the first of evidence. The second, the Babylonians' first month was named Nisanu, which the Jews transliterated into Hebrew as Nisan. From 499 BC onward, the Babylonian calendar did not permit Nisan to begin before the vernal equinox. Ezra 6:15 and Nehemiah 15 show that the use of Babylonian month names in Jerusalem, yet with Jews using these names throughout the Persian Empire. Okay, number 3, Esther chapter 9, verse 1 and 20 and 21 shows the 12th Jewish month to be Adar in the Persian Empire. And that month is the month of Purim that Jews would keep every single year in the month of Adar. So that's the third evidence. And then the fourth evidence, the Passover letter in the year 419, 418 BCE, written from a Jew in Judea to Jews on the island of Elephantine near the southern border of Egypt, where Persians administered the Babylonian calendar, explained that Nisan was the month of Passover. This shows that the Jew who wrote the letter from Judea expected that Nisan in the Babylonian calendar would be the same as Nisan in Judea, since that was the month of Passover. Thus, this letter that has survived in the very dry desert from over 2,400 years ago on this island is primary historical evidence that the month names in Jerusalem were expected to agree in time with the same month names in Persia. And number 5, Philo of Alexandria in the first century states that the vernal equinox begins the first month, as in other nations, those toward the east still use the Babylonian calendar. Okay. And now, chapter 19 is very interesting. We're up to chapter 19 now. Chapter 19 is very interesting because it relates to the context of Leviticus chapter 2, verses 41 and 42. That refers back to Yeshua, who went with his family every year with his parents to Jerusalem to keep the festival of Passover. And since he was keeping the right calendar at the Passover, it's interesting to note how the Septuagint translates the word Aviv. Because if Aviv was important in the first century for the calendar, then the translators of the Septuagint would surely know the meaning of Aviv, because it would be an important thing to look for every year as the people who want to use barley to determine the first month teach. Again, the people who use barley, they claim we have to look for Aviv, and we have to look for it being in the stage of Aviv, as if there's one narrow stage to pinpoint that you would know it's Aviv. But if it was so important in the first century that it was being used there in Leviticus 2, 41, 42 for the first month, then it would have been such common knowledge to use Aviv that the translators of the Septuagint would have known that. Okay, and let's look at this chapter 19. Concerning all 6 places in which the Hebrew expression Chodesh Aviv, month of the Aviv, occurs in the Tanakh, and I list all the places that we went through when we discussed this in the first session. Only one expression is used in the Septuagint. The Greek meant mini ton neon, which means month of the new. So it's interesting that the Greek in all six places where the Hebrew Bible has Kodesh HaAviv, month of the Aviv, the Septuagint translation translates it into the Greek that means month of the new. It doesn't say what's new. It just calls it the month of the new. The grammatical form of ton neon is plural, so that it implies a plural noun. This consistency in all places lends weight to the belief that the translators wanted to use the same meaning in all places. However, it indicates that they were not sure of its meaning because there's no plural noun. It seems safe to accept the belief that the translators knew it referred to new plant growth with plural connotations. The word new can imply freshness or recent growth and does not commit to any degree of ripeness or what vegetation was involved. In all six places, the very literal, careful Net's translation of the Septuagint has, quote, month of the new things, unquote. In other words, in all six places where month of Aviv occurs in the Hebrew, the Net's translation from the Septuagint translates it month of the new things, month of the new things, thus highlighting the noticeable lack of clarity for the word Aviv. These six places are seen in the Greek on page 922 of the Concordance by Hatch and Redpath under the word for month, or they may be looked up individually in the Brenton translation that has the Greek on one side of the page and English on the other in the Septuagint. So, points out month of the new things, that's what month of Aviv is translated for in the Septuagint, showing that the translators really didn't know what Aviv meant. And if it didn't know what it meant, how would the month of Aviv been so prominent in terms of barley knowledge? It would have been known well by the translators of the Septuagint if the word Aviv was known in terms of what it actually meant. Now, in Exodus chapter 9, verse 31, where the word Aviv occurs, this is for the hail plague. The question is, how does the Septuagint translate the word Aviv when it occurs for the hail plague in Exodus 9:31? Very, very interesting thing. In Exodus chapter 9, verse 31, where the word Aviv occurs, a literal translation from the Hebrew is, this is from the Hebrew now, not from the Greek yet, from the Hebrew. Barley was in the ear. Barley was in the ear. The Septuagint has the Greek word parastekuia, where Aviv occurs. And this Greek word is discussed on pages 56, 57 of Lee 1983. See, Lee is wanting to pinpoint this word as a commentary on this particular Greek word used in Exodus 9:31. And so Lee provides a few ancient examples of its use, the use of this word, parastekuia. I'm not saying it perfectly right. It's a Greek transliteration. Lee provides a few ancient examples of the use of this Greek word used in Exodus 9:31 for Aviv in an agricultural setting. He found agricultural settings for the use of this Greek word. On page 56, Lee provides the approximate choice of meanings. Quote, be ripe, be fully grown. That's what he says it means. This word means be ripe, be fully grown. Now, there's a problem with that meaning in terms of the hail plague. It makes sense that the translators were not aware of the variation of difference in the development of barley from southern Egypt to northern Egypt of 5 weeks, so that it could not be fully grown throughout the region. Otherwise, it would have been harvested in the south, where it would have been too ripe to leave on the stalks. So it couldn't have been fully ripe. And yet they used the translation that would mean fully ripe. So it shows that the translators did not know the meaning of Aviv, because the meaning of Aviv was so general and as to apply for all of the barley throughout the land of Egypt. The translators only lived in Alexandria. They knew barley when it ripened in Alexandria, which is very, very close. It was virtually on the Nile River. And so they didn't understand the context enough to recognize that the word aviv, if they understood its meaning properly, would refer to a large variation in growth. Instead, they translated only to what it was in Alexandria when they thought the hell plague was. They didn't give it the full 35-day expanse that the agriculture would require, because they just didn't know any better. And so they translated it fully ripe when it really didn't mean fully ripe. We discussed that when we went through the first part of this seminar, the previous lecture. And so the translators did not understand this variation in the growth of barley for the 5 weeks variation. And so the Greek with translation may be seen in Brenton, who did not have the examples that Lee had. In other words, Brenton's translation did not translate it as well as the new translation, the NETS, NETS translation. NETS stands New English Translation of the Septuagint. That's the abbreviated NETS, New Translation of the Septuagint. But Brenton didn't translate it that way because he didn't have Lee's understanding of what it meant. So when you look at Brenton's translation, it won't be translated that way. The new translation is far more accurate. The Greek word also appears on page 786, column 1 of the Hatch and Red Path, under the Greek word krethi, meaning barley, at Exodus 9:31. It is plausible that the translators of the Septuagint at Exodus 9:31 created the meaning of Aviv from this context rather than from a deep knowledge, because they did not carry this meaning into any of the other 7 uses of Aviv. Perhaps they did not remember that they gave this meaning to Aviv when they reached its next use in Exodus chapter 13, verse 4, where they simply used a single vague Greek word meaning new things, new, and they used the word things, adding that in the translation. The month of the new. In Leviticus 2:14, where Aviv occurs, the Septuagint has nia, which means new or fresh. This is not precise. In other words, instead of translating it grain, they just the word nia is used, which means new or fresh. This is not precise. The very literal Careful Net's translation contains the following group of words, quote, new, roasted, pounded, wheaten groats, unquote. Now, we went through this carefully in the first session, a literal translation of Leviticus 2:14 that contains the word aviv. The Septuagint only translates new, roasted, pounded, wheaten groats, does not have the word grain or ears in the translation, showing that they really didn't know what the word aviv meant. They left it untranslated. This must include both aviv and carmel as the Hebrew words. Here it seems that the translation for aviv is new, it seems that way, and the translation for carmel is wheaten groats, because that follows the order of the 2 Hebrew words. This makes it doubtful that the translators of the Septuagint knew the meaning of either word. We have seen that the Septuagint is imprecise and vague in every case for Aviv, except where the context has much to offer in Exodus 9:31. This indicates that the Jews in Alexandria do not seem to be aware of any important significance for this Hebrew word. Although some of them undoubtedly went to Jerusalem during the 7 days of unleavened bread, witnessed the wave sheaf offering, and understood how the first month was determined. It does not make common sense to think that the calendar's first month after Ezra was being determined by the use of the word Aviv. You know something? I rewrote the document, but I didn't enlarge it over here into the last chapter. I put the last chapter in the first version of the new document, but it didn't make it into this document. And I've got to figure out what happened if I didn't. I have to get the last chapter and show it over here.
All right. If you need to, like, just use the smaller version just to read through it, and then they can maybe go on your website, and read it in a full version if they need to.
Give me a moment to try to figure out what's happening.
Oh, sure. In the meantime, I can just fill it up with some comments about what I think so far, because man, you said a lot of things that were really helpful and interesting as far as the Septuagint and everything. Because I also get in debates about translations and stuff. So a lot of the points when you're talking about the Septuagint and the translations of just the Aviv and everything, kind of find that helpful. And also earlier, when you brought up, you found, okay.
I'm going to try and figure out what's happened over here, because I may have to look at this version and enlarge it. Let me just find here we go, BE 1010. Let me see here.
But while you're looking through that, I'll just.
There we go.
Okay.
There it is.
Okay, got it.
We have it. I'm just going to go through this chapter now. You could see it very large on the screen. The other document, it must have used the version I used for last week instead of this version that I have now.
Okay, so do you want to present what you are looking at now then, or?
Yes, I want to do it right now.
Okay.
I intended to do it now, and I'm going to do it now.
Okay. Well, I mean, do you need to present the document on the screen, like hit the present button and?
Oh, you're not seeing what I'm seeing.
Right.
Okay. So I need to find a way to get this document, this version of the document.
Well, yeah, just click the present button and then click just like how you did this one, and then just present your other document that you want to present.
Okay. Let's go back. Okay. How do I get that?
Present.
Oh, here we go. My son is very adept here. And
so is it slides or share screen? Did you want to just share your screen? Is that you did it last time?
Share screen.
Share screen. Okay, you can then.
How do I get the other document now?
Okay, now I think that is it showing your screen already to everybody or no?
No. He can either do share slides or share screen. He might want to do share slides, but it's up to him.
The share slides is not an option if he clicks on present. If you go here, hit the X real quick. So when he clicks on present, it shows the options of slides. Okay, click slides then. It does show slides. Okay, there we go. And then now we need to, from your computer, find the other one, unless it's one of those two.
So go to my
your computer. Okay, then click. Then we have to upload the file. I guess click upload file, and then find it from here.
This is the version.
Your browser has blocked your screen. As a guest, you can upload up to 2 slide decks. Please log in or sign up. So
My son is going to figure this out.
was that because the other one slides? Is this one the one that you did
BE
before?
is the right one.
Okay, well, let's see.
But it's getting the old version. It's not getting the new version.
All right, so let's just remove the old version then, and then let's go on. So let's remove the old one. Slides, erase, delete. Okay, now we can probably add the other one. Upload. Okay, and then this is the one.
It's the
new one right
BE.
here. All right, there you go. Now everyone can see. I think.
Oh, awesome. Okay, I know that for the future.
It's processing right here. Actually, just give it a second.
Oh, it's processing.
Yeah, it shouldn't take too long.
Glad my son is here because he's more adept at these things than I am. He's the one that does the website.
Here it is. Here we go.
There you go.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
But it's not enlarged.
I don't know if we'll be able to enlarge it because I think you'll have to do all the stuff you did the other time.
Oh, wait a second.
I just hit the left and right arrows to go left and right.
I have to get to the chapter 20. There it is, chapter 20.
Well, I mean I don't think. Oh, the link. Does the link work? No, I don't think so. You have to go all the way like this to get to 20 projects.
Okay, I have to page through it.
Yeah, well, you can hit the right arrow though, like this to go
Okay,
up faster.
all right. Just you do it faster that way.
You know which page it's on approximately?
It's probably a while.
It's gonna. You have to go all the way down. Let me hit the TV.
It's probably like page 90 at least.
Okay.
No, it's got to be like page 100 and something, like 100 and
It
at
does.
least 110.
Is there a faster way to go to just go to page or something?
I don't know. From your end, I couldn't tell you.
I got how to go faster. All right, so it only goes to 100 and something. So here's 20.
Okay.
Astronomy and the Hebrew Tikkun.
Ah, there we go.
Good job.
My son Jeff knew how to do this better than I did. All right, so there we go. We finally got the newer version, chapter 20. Okay. Astronomy and the Hebrew word Tekufa. This chapter is, I'll tell you this. When I started studying the calendar beginning in 1967, one of the things that intrigued me is the Hebrew word Tekufa. It's a head scratcher to me, the word Tekufa, because there were several lexicons that I looked at. And I looked at the 4 places where the Hebrew word Tekufa occurs, and it did not make sense to take the translations that are commonly used for the word Tekufa in the lexicons. They translated to mean circuit, and it didn't make sense to translate circuit in the 4 places. Some of them translated it equinox or solstice. Even translating it that way did not make sense. And so for 49 years, it was kind of a mystery to me as to what the word Tekufa meant. But finally, at the end of 49 years, all of a sudden in the summer of the year 2016, a light bulb went off in my head when I studied one of the contexts. And so the purpose of this chapter is to explain how the use of the Hebrew word Tekufa shows that the use of the vernal equinox was part of the biblical culture. That's the purpose of this chapter, and I'm so glad we got it to come up. I added this chapter a few days ago. The Hebrew word Tekufa, Strong's number 8622, occurs 4 times in the Hebrew Bible. Translations and lexicons of this word are vague and confusing because it is a challenge to make all 4 contexts have a consistent meaning. In other words, the same meaning in all 4 contexts. After decades of studying this word, I was able to see how to explain all 4 contexts with the same uniform meaning. These 4 contexts will be discussed in an order that most easily allows the context to be explained. Psalm 19, verses 1 through 6, is most certainly an astronomical context that has the Hebrew word Tekufa, because it talks about the heavens declaring the glory of Yahweh. So it's talking about the heavens. It's an astronomical context. The end of verse 6 says, nothing is covered from its, and the its is a reference back to the sun. Nothing is covered from its heat. The heat of the sun is noteworthy in the summer. And the summer begins with the summer solstice, about June 21st, and it ends with the autumnal equinox. That's about September 23rd. Understanding the context requires some explanation. That's the context of Psalm 19. The context does not refer to one single day, as is often assumed by the reader. That's the way I first read it. I'm trying to figure out what it meant as a single day. But when I did, it doesn't make sense. It does not make sense to understand verse 6 as a single day. It begins in verse 4 and runs through verse 6. And so the 3 verses, 4 through 6, are a unit. And they have a unit that has the same context as a meaning. The context does not refer to a single day, as is often assumed by the reader, but instead the totality of paths of the sun during an entire year as seen by a person from one location in Israel. Repeat that. The totality of paths of the sun during an entire year as seen by a person from one location in Israel. Verse 4 has the word tent, which refers to the boundary of the annual collection of all paths of the sun's travel as seen from one location in Israel. Since the greater part of the heat of the sun is felt during the middle of the summer, it seems appropriate to accept the meaning of summer season for Tekufa in Psalm 19, verse 6. In other words, if you're looking at the context as referring to what happens in all of the paths of the sun, all of the paths of the sun for an entire year, then it talks about the heat in verse 6, the heat of the sun in verse 6. And so it would appear that the word Tekufa is talking about the summer season, which is when it's hot. Because when we get to the translation of the whole verse, you'll see how I get that. Here's a paraphrase of Psalm 19, verse 6. Now, I'm going to be word for word, very, very literal, exactingly literal in a little bit, but I'm going to give a paraphrase of verse 6 of Psalm 19 first. Here's a paraphrase of Psalm 19, verse 6, based on the whole context, the context meaning verses 4, 5, and 6, focusing on the summer season as part of the whole year. Here's the Psalm 19:6 in paraphrase. The sun goes forth from the northern, and I add square brackets for the word northern. The sun goes forth from the northern end of the heavens and its summer season in accordance with the boundaries of its decrees, and nothing is covered from its heat. The heat occurs in the summer season. And that's why when you look at this from a whole year's perspective, when it talks about the heat, it has to be referring to the summer season. And the word summer season is the translation that I'm giving for the word Tekufa, the summer season. Here, the northern end of the heavens is for the sun occurring at the summer solstice about June 21. In other words, if you look at all of the paths of the sun for a whole year, the paths of the sun is at the northernmost end on June 21st, at the summer solstice. It's at the most southern end at the autumn solstice. It is right in the middle at the equinoxes. That's simply the way the paths are, the paths of the sun during the whole year. It goes back and forth from the northernmost path of the sun during the year to the southernmost path of the sun during the year, which is at the opposite solstice, the autumn solstice. That's the way the path of the sun works for a year. It's at the northern end of the heavens. So when it says in Psalm 19:6, the sun goes forth from the, I added the word northern, from the northern end. The end occurs at the summer solstice, the northern end. And it's summer season, that summer begins at that point, but when it gets hot during the summer season. So the sun goes forth. This is day by day throughout the season. The sun goes forth from the northern end of the heavens, and it's summer season in accordance with the boundaries of its decrees, and nothing is covered from its heat. The boundaries refer to the boundaries that the sun can take on through all its paths during the year. The boundaries of the sun, when seen all through the year, it goes through slice by slice by slice, moving further and further and further from the northern boundary as it goes through the year to the southern boundary. So trying to point out here is all of the paths of the sun. The boundaries, the word boundaries, does occur in this verse. Now the boundaries are from one end of the heavens to the other end of the heavens as it goes through the season. Now, I'm going to give a literal translation of verses 4 through 6. My literal translation of verses 4 through 6 is presented next. This is not easy to translate in a fashion that makes all of the words clear because of what the reader is expected to understand about astronomy in the context. For those readers who may desire to make the effort to study the Brown-Driver-Briggs lexicon for some of the literal translation, I occasionally add square brackets with BDB for the Hebrew word. Now, when I read this, I'm going to skip over the square brackets to give a literal translation. But for the sake of the reader who wants to do an in-depth, deep study with Brown-Driver-Briggs lexicon, I added in square brackets where you could find the Hebrew word, what part of the page the Hebrew word is at in Brown-Driver-Briggs lexicon, and the meaning that I've used in the literal translation. So I'm going to skip over what's in square brackets, but I'm giving you, the reader from the document, the actual place to do the research to see where I got the translation of the Hebrew from. So this is Psalm 19, verse 4. Their trail has gone through all the earth and into the end of the world. Now, the word trail is a reference to the orbit. The orbit as you go through the year. Their decrees for the sun. Now, decrees are Yahweh's gravity. That's how he made the solar system. The laws of gravity that cause the earth to go through and from the sun as seen from the earth. The decrees of the gravity created by Yahweh in order to make it appear the way he has in the sun in the sky for the year. Their decrees for the sun have established a tent. A tent refers to the boundaries of travel during the course of a full year for the sun. That's what the boundaries refer to in them. And the word tent is used to describe the boundaries. In other words, the Hebrew word for tent is an important Hebrew word in this context because the tent shows where in the sky the sun travels during the course of a year. That's the word tent. Verse 5, and he, the subject is still the sun, and he goes out from his chamber as a bridegroom. And he goes out all through the tent, all through the year. He rejoices like a mighty man to run its path. Verse 6, he, referring to the sun, goes forth from the end of the heavens, and his summer season, in accordance with the ends of them, and nothing is covered from its heat. Now, let's see now. Where let me go back to the end because this word summer season should be in here. Yeah, there it is. On the very bottom line, a verse of this on page here. He, the sun, goes forth from the end of the heavens, and his season. That's the word tekufa. And I added the word summer because there's 4 seasons. I'm pinpointing which of the 4 seasons it is. It's the end of the verse refers to the heat. So when you're referring to the season in which there's heat, that's the summer season. So I added in square brackets the word summer. So he, the sun, goes forth from the end of the heavens, and his summer season, in accordance with the ends of them. The ends meaning you're at the northern end of the heavens, where the sun goes in its tent, and nothing is covered from its heat during that season. Now, you have to, when people read this, when I try to read this at first, over and over again, I was thinking it refers to the path of the sun during one single day. It doesn't make sense to think of it in terms of one single day. It does make sense if you think of all the paths of the sun during the whole year when it traces out a tent in the sky for the whole year. And it's at the summer solstice, it's at the northernmost point. And then during the summer, it moves toward the autumnal equinox. And that's indicating the path of the summer. Anyway, I have to just leave it to you to go through this and to understand why the translation that I gave has the meaning it does, and that the word tekufa refers to the summer in terms of when it's hot. It's the hot season, the summer season. It's the summer season is the word tekufa. The sun reaches its most northern daily path at the summer solstice, approximately when the amount of daylight is the longest in the northern hemisphere. This most northern path is in fact an end of all the daily paths during the year and relates to Strong's number 7097 in verse 6. Now the question arises, Paul, concerning the meaning of the plural ends in verse 4. We note the use of the tent that was established by decrees, the laws of physics spoken by the Almighty that keep the position of the sun within its bounds of travel. This tent is the visible boundaries of travel of the sun during the course of a full year. There are 2 annual ends of travel. The northern end is defined by the path of the sun at the summer solstice, and the southern end is defined by the path of the sun at the winter solstice. The winter solstice, that's around December 21st. Verse 6 looks at the totality of paths of the sun as those appear from one place in the northern hemisphere rather than to what occurs on any single day. In verse 6 above, there is the expression in accordance with, that is found on page 754 left upper page in Brown Driver Briggs for the Hebrew preposition al. This is getting a little bit technical. You'd have to look at the concordance, see why I translated it in accordance with, because it is one of the meanings of that word there. Here, this refers to the decrees from verse 4, spoken words of the Almighty that establish the laws of physics that govern the movement of the sun as it appears from the earth. Verse 4 calls this the tent of the sun's movement. The northern boundary of the tent is the summer solstice, and the southern boundary of the tent is the winter solstice. In the book chapter by Johann Meyer, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls is discussed that contains the Hebrew word tekufa. On page 146, Meyer wrote, "The songs themselves are attached to the 13 Sabbaths of 1 quarter or season, tekufa, of a year, according to the editor, the first quarter, the Nisan season only," unquote. Here we see the Hebrew word tekufa used for the season of spring, which begins with the vernal equinox and ends with the summer solstice. This shows that in the culture of the first century in Judea, the word tekufa was used for the season that began with the vernal equinox and ended with the summer solstice. In other words, I pointed out from Psalm 19, verse 6, that the word heat is a reference to the tekufa, the summer season. In this particular place, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the word tekufa is used for the spring season. For the spring season. In Brown Driver Briggs on page 880, at the bottom right, the meaning for tekufa is coming around circuit. This guess, it's only a guess, for its meaning will also lead to Brown Driver Briggs' subjective meaning for the preposition look, the single letter lamed that is prefixed to tekufa in 1 Samuel 20 and 2 Chronicles 24, verse 23, to be discussed next. See, I'm going to go through all 4 contexts for tekufa. This prepositional prefix is discussed on pages 510 to 518 of Brown Driver Briggs. Meaning 6 concerns the context of time, and this is discussed with categories and examples from page 516, bottom right, page 517, left middle. Now, it's getting hairy. I don't expect you'd have to look at Brown Driver Briggs to understand all of these contexts. I'm trying to explain here the meaning of this in terms of context and tekufa. Since the meaning of summer season for tekufa was indicated from the context of Psalm 19:6, this concept of season will be kept in mind for the sake of consistency, if possible, in other examples. A meaning for the prepositional prefix look will be selected from those given above by Brown Driver Briggs. Here's 2 Chronicles 24:23. And it came about during the spring season, that's tekufa, I added the word spring, of the year, the army of Aram marched against them. You see, the time that armies go out to fight a battle is after the winter, because people don't want to go out and fight a battle in the winter when it's cold, when it's snowing, when you have to carry winter clothing around with you. But they do go out in the spring. And there are translations that translate this spring in 2 Chronicles 24:23. There are translations like the New American Standard Bible. The New American Standard Bible in 2 Chronicles 24:23 does translate the word tekufa, spring. So what I'm simply taking is the word tekufa, and it should be the time when an army goes out to battle. They go out to battle in the spring. So it makes sense to translate it, and it came to be during the spring season of the year that the army of Iran marched against them. So the word Tekufa again means a season. Again means a season. So it meant summer season in Psalm 19, verse 6, and it means spring season here in 2 Chronicles 24, 23. And it implies the equinox that bounds it at the beginning of the spring and the summer solstice at the end of the spring. So it shows 2 of the 4 points of the year as boundaries for Tekufa here. And so the vernal equinox is shown by Tekufa here because it begins the spring season. So this is from the scripture with the word Tekufa as the meaning of the word season, beginning with the vernal equinox in this particular use of the word season. And so you see that the actual word for vernal equinox, while it's not here as a specific word, it is here as a boundary for the word Tekufa. So the actual boundary for the word Tekufa is the vernal equinox indicated here. The boundary for the word Tekufa here is the vernal equinox as the beginning point of the spring season. So it does show it in the context of the culture that the word Tekufa is understood to begin with the vernal equinox. So the concept of a season is in part of the Hebrew culture through the season. Here the word during was used for the prepositional prefix lo. 2 Chronicles 24:23 is a biblical context that recognizes the spring season, which begins with the vernal equinox. Now, 1 Samuel 1:20 is an interesting challenge to translate, but there's a very plausible explanation that leads to consistency with the above. First, a translation will be given, and then an explanation will follow. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 20. And it came to be at the close of 2 full seasons, Tekufa in the plural form, Hannah conceived and she gave birth to a son. You see, Hannah was barren and she was crying. And the priest saw that she was crying and asked her, why is she crying? And she said, because I can't give birth. I'm barren. And so he pronounced a blessing upon her. And the blessing would be that she would give birth. And the time frame that was at the close of 2 full seasons, Hannah conceived and she gave birth to a son. So Tekufa is in the plural. Tekufa is in the plural. And I have a little more comment to make upon this verse. Here the expression at the close of was used for the prepositional prefix lo. The expression with the kufa in the plural in the Hebrew is literally, you have to look at it literally in the Hebrew, season of the days. Season of the days. This is parallel to the biblical idiom month of days, where the word month is kodesh in Genesis and in Numbers, and the word month is yerach in Deuteronomy. Virtually all translations take the expression month of days to mean full month. Through parallelism with the concept of days, seasons of the days would mean full seasons. In Daniel 7:25, we find for times, times, and half a time. Here, the plural times without any qualifier is taken by commentaries to mean 2. Parallelism with this example would imply that the meaning is 2 full seasons, as in the above translation. That's a translation that I gave that's intended to be literal, 2 full seasons. From the above, it is sensible that Tekufa means season. And this is in Psalm 19:6, in 1 Samuel 1:20, and 2 Chronicles 24:23. The only other example with Tekufa is in Exodus 34, verse 22, to be discussed next. See, so there was 2 more full seasons to go by before the prophet Samuel was born from Hannah. Now, Exodus 34, verse 22 is an exciting verse to translate. A literal translation of Exodus 34, verse 22 is this, quote, "And you shall observe the Feast of Weeks, the first fruits of the harvest of wheat, and the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of the Ingathering, during the autumn season to Kufa of the year." That is when it occurs. The Feast of the Ingathering is another name for the Feast of Tabernacles in the scripture. So it's saying the Feast of Tabernacles occurs during the autumn season to Kufa. That makes sense, and it always does. Recognizing that the first month, Nisan or Aviv, occurs in the spring season, fully in the spring season, will always make the Feast of Tabernacles occur in the autumn season. In the autumn season. And then this makes perfect sense. Exodus 34, verse 22 says, "You shall observe the Feast of Weeks, the first fruits of the harvest of wheat, and the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Tabernacles, during the autumn season to Kufa of the year." So it makes perfect sense, and it does. Feast of Tabernacles always occurs in the autumn. It does. The first day of the seventh month never begins before the autumnal equinox. So, in the above translation, it is plausible that ancient Israelites understood that the preposition lo was implied because of its use in 1 Samuel 1:20 and 2 Chronicles 24:23. The addition of the word during comes from one of the choices above from Brown Driver Briggs. Exodus 34, verse 22 is an affirmation that the Feast of Tabernacles occurs during the autumn season. Thus, all four uses of Tekufa may sensibly be translated as season in the sense of the four seasons of the year. These examples show summer, spring, and autumn. These four particular places, it shows specifically once in the summer, once in the spring, and once in the autumn. All four seasons are bounded by an equinox and a solstice. Hence, there is biblical evidence that the ancient Israelite culture included the use of equinoxes and solstices. Consistency in meaning that is sensible in all contexts is a strong argument in favor of season for the meaning of Tekufa. There is no technical reason that Tekufa should refer to the harvest of crops, especially when Tekufa occurs in a clearly astronomical context in Psalm 19, verse 6. Exodus 23, verse 16 has the literal ending and the Feast of the Ingathering at the end of the year in your gathering of your produce from the field. The year in ancient Israel is often taken to have a reckoning from spring to spring as the religious year and a reckoning from fall to fall as the civil year. In this latter sense of the civil year, the word end would apply. In other words, the end of the civil year would be at about the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. Genesis 1:14 does not have the word Tekufa, but at least we can say that the Hebrew language does show the awareness of equinoxes and solstices, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as according to Scripture. And so there you have it. The last chapter does show, with the use of the word Tekufa, that the knowledge of the vernal equinox specifically was shown to be known in the Hebrew biblical culture. And so that is the final chapter. The crowning touch with the word Tekufa, which in the case of the spring is bounded by the vernal equinox to start it and the summer solstice to end it. I know that's a big thing to swallow, but I decided I wanted to get it in there. And it does show through the culture of the first century that the vernal equinox was known. And so there you have it.
All right. Hey, I just one clarification. So, because so Takufa means season, right? Like, so there's 4 seasons, so there would be 4 Takufas. Do I got that right, or did I miss
That's
something?
right. That's right. There are four
Okay.
Takufa, 4 seasons. The word Takufa can refer to either the summer, the fall, the winter, or the spring. Any one of those 4 seasons is Takufa. And
Okay.
each one of them has a specific boundary on two sides, an equinox or a solstice on both sides of each of the 4 seasons.
All right. Yeah, because I did have someone say something about equinox versus solstice question mark. I'm not sure what she's asking.
Well, you see, there's one lexicon that translates the words of Takufa as equinox or solstice, one or the other. But it can't mean that. It's a whole expanse of time. It can't mean a single day. It can't mean a single point.
Oh, okay.
It has to mean a season. In other words, a quarter of the year. It has to mean a whole quarter of the year, not a boundary point. There are some lexicons that imagine and say that it means one of the 4 points of the year, equinox or solstice. No, it doesn't mean a point of the year. It means a quarter of the year, the season.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, not my brain now. It does remember something you said earlier. So yeah, okay. So I'm glad because it helps reinforce it in my mind. So, because I forgot you did mention something earlier about it's not a single point. So, um,
Well, Philo understood it to be that way. There's one place in Philo where he understood the actual word vernal equinox to refer to the whole season that begins with the vernal equinox. Because what he says is, you have to go back, it's in the document, a quote from Philo, where he says the first month is at the beginning of the vernal equinox. And the vernal equinox, in that sense, is referring to the entire season that begins with the vernal equinox. He's saying the first month begins at the beginning of the spring.
all right. And someone had a question about this PDF that you got up on the screen. Is this available on the website? This exact presentation?
What I have to do, the document itself, I've enlarged it to make it visible in the document that you're looking at. If you notice on the very bottom of the document, it has a 101. That's 101 in terms of the slides, but in terms of the pages, this is only on page 38. So I have a 38-page document that I've gone through. The 38-page document my son will put on the website.
Okay, and you already have the one from last week on your website, right?
But that did not get on the website yet.
Okay, because there was someone that was asking about that, and I said, yeah, I'll ask them about that once the presentation's done if they're going to be putting it on.
See, when I did it last week, I gave the version that did not have the last chapter. This one does have the first chapter, and it even has an introduction to the next to the last chapter. I said that the introduction, I gave it out from my mouth, but it was not written down because I didn't realize that I was using last week's version on the screen. It was only when I was looking for this chapter and it was missing that my son came along and got the newer version up. And the newer version had the last chapter in it. The one from last week did not. But I sent you an email a day ago with this new version. So you have the latest version with this last chapter.
Okay, yeah, see, I was just wondering if I needed to make it available, because if it's already on your website, I could just direct everyone to go to your website.
It will be. I got to have my son added to the website.
Okay, all right. So, folks, I'll like whenever he adds it, I'll put it into the description. That way, you can go to his site, help give him a little more traffic towards his website, and I'll just do it that way.
But if you have a way of getting it on any presentation, you can make it available separately if you want to.
Okay, I might do that. I'll put your website link, which is already in the description, but when this show's over, I got to figure out, because I guess I didn't do it right last week when I tried to add it, so I'll try to figure out and mess around with it and get it added, because I thought I was sharing it from the Google Drive.
Well,
So,
the version I gave you last week did not have this last chapter.
okay. Well, folks, I'll toy around with it and see how I get that link to work. Cause I thought I had last week's the one you gave me last week. I thought that I had that working in the description, and I guess someone said they tried to click it and it wasn't working, so I got to go back through it but instead I'll add this one since this is the updated one.
One more comment. And next to the last chapter, the chapter before this one, was the one in which I pointed out that the translators of the Septuagint did not understand the meaning of the word of Eve. That was the whole goal of that chapter before this, that the translators of the Septuagint did not know the meaning of the word of Eve, but they would have known the meaning of the word of Eve if barley would have been used for the first month. That's the reason why it was there. And what it does show is that in Luke chapter 2, verses 41 and 42 in the early first century, the calendar could not have been using the barley, because if it would have been using the barley, the Septuagint translators would have known how to translate it, because it would have been used year after year for when the first month would begin. They would know the meaning of the word of Eve to be what it actually does mean from the Hebrew, but the Septuagint didn't use it with that meaning because they didn't know its meaning. They would have known of its meaning if barley was being used. And what I'm showing is that the culture of the first century was against the identity of the first month using barley.
Yeah, I think you made that really clear, especially when you went over Philo. I read that part in Philo too, and I just went right over it and missed it. It's like, I mean, I guess that's the difference between doing years of study and you notice, you pick up on a detail like that. Whereas I just glanced right over it. So, but anyway, let's see here. A couple comments. Stephanie says, "Wow, all the just incredible, all of Herb's years of studying that led to the conclusion of the meaning of season." And she says, "I thought the information on the elephantine that Herb shared was excellent picture of how to understand the times." So Stephanie liked it, and I did have a couple questions.
Yes.
Let's see here. Day of Atonement. Okay, yeah, this person earlier, they said Day of Atonement for 2024 is October 13th, so this speaker is very close. And they go on to say probably he is just starting at the first possible sighting of the moon rather than the conjunction. I'd be interested in learning why. He is very informed, it seems.
Well, let me explain something. The conjunction does not begin a month. It's the lights in the heavens, the light bearers in the heavens. Conjunction, there's no light. It's darkness. The darkness does not begin a month. There can be from 1 to 3 nights of darkness every month. When the weather is perfectly clear, the worst case is you can go for 3 full nights without seeing the moon. Most of the time it's once or twice, but occasionally you can go for 3 full nights with clear weather and not see the moon at all. And so you cannot go by a darkness. They didn't have a way of calculating the conjunction. See, there's a second separate document available that discusses when in history people were first able to approximately calculate the conjunction. And it was not until about the year 360 BC, 1,000 years after Moses, that people could first calculate the conjunction. So the conjunction could not have been used for the calendar at the time of Moses. They would have had no way of calculating the conjunction at the time of Moses. Now,
Yeah, one thing
the sighting of
he
a
also says there he mentions the sighting of a crescent. He said this way earlier, by the way. He said there he mentions the sighting of the crescent. I understand many people do that, but I would like to know why.
that would be another whole long session of another, maybe some other time I'd go through the why of it. And it's not going to take as many hours as it was to do this or the one last week, but it requires going through very specific scriptures and going through certain details to go through I'd have to get a bunch of scriptures together, and I'd have to enlarge the document so you could see it again. It's another whole document to describe how does a month begin, and proof from the scripture. There's proof from the scripture that the new crescent starts the month. And he's asking for an explanation here. I want to give it, but I want it to be thorough. And I can't be thorough without getting the scriptures out and methodically going through the scriptures that show it.
Could you provide maybe just a 30-second bit of info, or like maybe like what you would think was like one quick like one of the best proofs for that, maybe?
Let me just.
I mean, if I'm putting you on the spot, don't worry about it.
It's much better if I actually do it with scriptures than to make an attempt to do it. First of all, it's got to be lights in the heavens. The conjunction is not a light in the heavens. It's a light bearer in the heavens. A light bearer is a source of light. The moon is a source of light. The crescent is a source of light. Darkness, a conjunction, is not a light. It's a darkness. And since you could have up to 3 significant nights when you can't see the moon at all, there's 3 successive nights of darkness. How can it be the conjunction when it has to be a light bearer, a trigger, a light trigger that starts a month? A light trigger cannot start a month if it's a darkness. In other words, it just doesn't make sense with Genesis 1:14 that it's a conjunction. Makes absolutely no sense that it can be a conjunction when that's a darkness. How can a light bearer begin a month if it's a darkness? And besides, you couldn't calculate it. The ability to calculate it did not occur for anybody until 1,000 years after Moses. If nobody could calculate it, how can they use it? It doesn't make sense, either from the standpoint of light bearers in the heavens or from the point of view of the inability to calculate it. Besides, light bearers are not calculations. It's lights. It's not a calculation. So the whole thing doesn't make any sense to think of being a conjunction.
Yeah, most people don't think something's there when they don't see it. So it does kind of just make kind of like a practical sense. Like if you have to see a car before you know a car is there, you have to see something there before you know it's there. So how do you know it's even there if you don't even see it, right?
Right.
And it's kind of like knowledge is the same way. How do you know something if and knowledge is considered light, so it's like, how do you know it, and if the light's not there? And so I would just, that would be just my little 2-cent way of doing it and explaining it
from the scripture itself. And I don't mind doing that, but I want to do it in the scripture context.
right.
Okay. And separately from that, Philo of Alexandria, that specifically mentions the vernal equinox, does in one of his places specifically say that the month begins when your eye once again could see the beauty of the moon. In other words, he does show that it is, and he says it's after the conjunction. The conjunction was a well-known thing by Greek astronomers at the time of Philo. They did calculate the conjunction at the time of Philo. But Philo says that the beauty of the moon is revealed to your eye after the conjunction. And so Philo is a witness specifically that you could see the day when the new moon occurs. But he's not in the Bible. He's outside the Bible. I'm not using Philo as my proof. There are things in the Bible that prove it.
But it does show culturally that's how they were doing it. So I mean that's why it's important.
Well, culturally in the first century it shows it, yes.
And if anyone's got any more questions, feel free to share them. I mean, that's the only one I really saw. I mean, the only other one I saw was truth, and some of these people are very new to all this. So, and she says, how often in a year can darkness be no moon?
Well, let me just say this. When you look up at the sky and you look for the moon, what you will find is that when you could first see it, it's a crescent, a narrow crescent in the western sky toward the west in the evening. That's what happens. Now, each night, the moon becomes thicker and thicker and thicker until finally it becomes a full moon. And then it becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. And when it becomes thinner and thinner and thinner, the way to see it is in the late night. Later and later in the night, you could see it get to a thin crescent. And finally, the very last day that you could see it at all, it becomes called, instead of the new crescent, it's called the old crescent. And when you see it, it's in the dimness in the morning. See, the new crescent you see in the evening when the sun is going down is when you see it. But the old crescent you see in the morning as the night fades into the morning. It's the opposite. So the old crescent you see in the morning, the new crescent you see in the evening. Now, when you see it in the morning, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner until you cannot see it anymore. And then you have darkness. You have darkness for the next night. And you can have from 1 to 3 nights when you cannot see the moon at all with perfectly clear weather. Now, the reason that happens has to do with the way the moon orbits the Earth. It's, first of all, is not a circle. It's an ellipse. And the Earth is not in the center of the ellipse. The Earth is not in the center of the elliptical orbit of the moon around the Earth. And because of that, the pattern of how the Earth is situated with respect to the moon varies according to whether it's at the furthest end of its place with respect to the orbit of the moon around the Earth. There's 2 ends. Every ellipse has what's called 2 foci in mathematics. And you're getting into mathematics, which I did study, and calculus is involved in the whole thing. But to try to describe to a layman an ellipse, I can put 2 nails in a string, attach 2 nails to a string and make it go around, and you'll see a path of an ellipse. And one of the 2 nails is at one of the 2 foci, and the other nail is at the other of the 2 foci. If you put a string and tie it at ends of 2 nails, hammer it into a piece of wood, and then you take a pencil and stretch it on the outside of the string as you go all the way around, it makes an ellipse. And where the 2 nails are is where the Earth is. It's not in the center of the ellipse. It's where one of the 2 nails are of the elliptical orbit of the Earth. And because of the pattern of the variation of how the ellipse is, that's why it sometimes takes longer to come out of the elliptical orbit to where you see it, because it has to do with the way the sun hits the moon and then bounces back from the moon till the light hits your eye. And it depends where in that orbit it is as to how long it takes. That's the best that I can kind of.
That's good. The only thing I could maybe add to that is that I would say that because the moon it's got a 29.5 day cycle. You're gonna normally after an astronomical new moon, that means it's like perfectly black. It's going to take about 24 hours to see the crescent, and depending on like what time of evening that is, you might have to wait another day. So like astronomical new moon at 5 o'clock today, or not 5 o'clock, but let's say it's like astronomical new moon at 8 o'clock tonight. Well, you wouldn't see it the next night, probably. You might have to wait one more night to see it.
I want to add more clarification. One more clarification.
Okay.
And it has to do with the fact that the Earth is not a perfect sphere. It's more pear-shaped. It's shaped a little bit fatter in the southern hemisphere than it is in the northern hemisphere. And the reason why that has happened has to do with the tug of the moon upon the Earth. The tug of the moon upon the Earth's ocean is partly responsible for that. I mean, I don't expect it to be common sense. I really don't. But having studied astronomy some, I'm adding the thought here, and it has to do with the difference between the autumn and the spring in terms of where the sun is. The Earth goes on an axis, and it has to do with how the axis is in the spring compared to the autumn. And that's the reason why from the time of the conjunction until the time that you could see the crescent is shortest around the time of the vernal equinox and longest around the time of the autumnal equinox. Now, I realize that it's not going to be intuitive to your mind, but it has to do with the way the Earth's axis spins on its axis, that it can take up to 72 hours, the worst case, in the autumn of the year. It can take up to 72 hours from the conjunction until the time you actually see the new crescent in the time of the autumn. And that cannot be true in the time of the spring. In the time of the spring, it's going to take at most 28 hours from conjunction until the time you see the crescent in the springtime, in the early spring, is at most 28 hours. However, in the fall, in the autumn equinox, it's at most 72 hours. And that is the reason why you can have up to 3 nights when you can't see the moon, but that only happens near the time of the autumn equinox. But it brought this to mind again from when I had read this in the past. It's from the time of conjunction until you see the crescent in the early spring, it's a maximum of 28 hours. In the autumn, it's a maximum of 72 hours.
Oh wow, I didn't know it was that much of a difference between autumn and spring.
It is.
And I kind of forgot about that. I do remember it having to be. It was longer in the autumn, but I forgot it was like I don't even know if I don't think I read about it being that much of a difference. So that's kind of surprising.
If you look at the Encyclopedia Judaica from 1971, the second edition has come out sometime around 2001 or thereabouts. The second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica has come up. But I'm used to the first edition, where I did my original study from 1971. And in that particular edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica, if you look under the article on the Jewish calendar, the author, Weissenberg, says this. He says that in the worst case, it can be up to 72 hours to the conjunction. So he's an authority to look at to see this, what I'm saying.
And you said that was Weissenberg? Is that
Well, he wrote the article in the Encyclopedia Judaica on the calendar.
Okay.
If you look at the Encyclopedia Judaica from 1971, I think the article is essentially the same in the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. I think I looked at it and I didn't see any difference. But he wrote the article on the Jewish calendar, Weissenberg, and he has several pages of the Encyclopedia Judaica on the Jewish calculated calendar. And in that article, he makes a statement similar to what I just told you.
All right, that's cool. Yeah, I was just making sure I got that name right. So if I looked it up in the future, or if someone else wanted to look it up in the future, so.
There, at the very end of the article, his name is there.
All right, awesome. Let's see here. Does anyone else see? Okay, so Stephanie asked, Ezekiel 1:1 mentions the fourth month. What month is it referring to? Would we count the fourth month as 3 months after Nisan?
Yes. It's, in other words, the month as it begins with Nisan is the first month, Iyar is the second month, and so on. And it's referring to the fourth month, and when the month is numbered, a number of the month is given. It's always counted from Nisan as the first. The civil year starts out with the seventh month, and the modern calculated calendar is based on a calculation for the first day of the seventh month.
All right, that's
I want to
awesome.
make another statement. Since we're still on, and there's not really a hurry to end it right now, I want to make another statement. I spent a lot of time looking into the history of the calculated calendar, the history of the modern Jewish calculated calendar. And it actually began, the calculation for the modern calculated calendar began about the year 800, 1200 years ago. It did not begin at the time of Hillel II, as many sources make the claim. It really began about the year 800. And that's an interesting thing. There's a book that was published in the year 2011. I want to discuss that book for a moment. That book that was published in the year 2011 is a translation of a book that was written in the year 1148, 1149, in that 2-year period, 1148, 1149. That book was written in Hebrew by Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra. Abraham ibn Ezra. Abraham ibn Ezra wrote many commentaries on the Old Testament, and he was an astronomer, and he was a mathematician. And Abraham ibn Ezra wrote a book on the calculated calendar of the Jews in the year 1148, 1149. That book was translated in English and published for the first time in the year 2011. I have a photocopy of that whole book. That book is the only source I was able to find. I suspected for decades, but did not find the evidence until I read it in that book. That book explains that the calculated calendar that the modern Jews use today was based upon the calculations for Easter. Both of them use a 19-year cycle. The calculation for the Sunday Easter uses a 19-year cycle. The calculation for the modern calculated calendar uses the same 19-year cycle. The details are different. The Easter calendar calculation uses what they call an epact, where the Jewish calendar does not use the Roman Catholic epact, but the Jewish calendar was designed to make Passover. Let me say another word here to make this more precise. There's a Dionysius Exiguus is the person that finally, after hundreds of years, made the Alexandrian church agree with the Roman church. For several hundred years, the calculation that was used for Easter Sunday by the church in Alexandria was not always the same as the calculation for Easter Sunday by the Church at Rome. There were two different dates for Easter some years. Most years they agreed with one another. Some years they were different. And the reason is that the calculation for Easter Sunday was different from Alexandria as it was for Rome. And it was finally Dionysius Exiguus that finally got the two cities to agree with his calculation for Easter. So Dionysius Exiguus, I can't remember right now the exact year, but it's in the document that I wrote that's available on my son's website. The exact year is in there. And the document from 2011, it's in there under the author's name, Abraham Ibn Ezra. Under Ibn Ezra is his last name, Abraham is his first name. And if you look for the calendar basics, that's the calendar basics. It's on my son's website, biblicalcalendar.org. It has this book from 2011, and I quote from it. And in the quotation, and I have to explain the quotation a little bit here. There's two things: the theory, and then the actual calculation. The theory explains in words how the calendar was designed for Easter Sunday, and then the calculation is separate. Now, believe it or not, I'm going to say it again, believe it or not, the theory that does not agree with the calculation. Dionysius Exiguus first wrote the theory, but the calculation to fit the theory does not agree with the theory. You got the website coming up.
Yeah, in case anyone, in case you say something, then I can just scroll and then show people.
There's two documents that have that Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra. One of them is stop.
Okay.
Go down a little further. Go down.
Okay. Right here, the treatise on the biblical calendar. You want to keep scrolling.
Lower.
Okay.
Go a little bit lower. It's the one that's historical departure. One of these documents here is historical departure from the biblical calendar. That has the quote. Now it's I guess you passed it. It's
okay.
up high.
Let me try it one more time. I'll just go. Oh, right here. It's the second one down.
That's it. Historical departure from the biblical calendar. That has the reference work and the quotation. But when I'm going to say more words about that document written in 1148, 1149, the translated in English, this document has the reference to it in the back in the bibliography references. But Dionysius Exiguus is the one who gave how it's supposed to be calculated. He also gave the calculation, but the calculation does not agree with the method that he said. Now, the Jews wanted to follow the method that he said, but a different calculation than Dionysius Exiguus made. Now, the first one that I know of that found the error in the calculation was Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra. And in his book on the calculated calendar, he points out that the Roman Catholic Church is keeping Easter on the wrong day some years. And he actually gives a table of years in his lifetime in which the Roman Catholic calculation for Easter is incorrect. It doesn't agree with the theory that Dionysius Exiguus said. In other words, Diogenes Exiguus wrote the theory for the calculation of Sunday Easter. But his own calculation as how to arrive at that theory was wrong in some years. And Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra pointed out that the Roman Catholic calculation for Easter was incorrect. But he said the Jewish calculation is right. The Roman Catholic calculation is wrong. And that is the reason why in the year 2024, this very year, that the Roman Catholic calculation of Easter Sunday is a year before the Jewish Passover.
Give me a month before.
The calculation of the Jewish Passover is made, and it was designed by the Jews around the year 800 to make the Passover fall shortly before Easter Sunday. That's how it was designed. The Jewish calculated calendar was designed to make the Passover fall a few days before Easter Sunday. And Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra realized why that sometimes does not happen. They designed it to happen, but the reason why it doesn't happen is because the calculation for Easter Sunday is wrong. And the places in which Easter Sunday falls a month earlier than the Jewish Passover, that is when the Catholic calculation for Easter is wrong.
Like this year.
Like this year. Most years, Jewish Passover occurs right before Easter Sunday.
Because I think it's like that. A lot of times, it's like maybe three. I know it's like a couple of times in a 19-year cycle, at least like once or twice in a 19-year cycle, if not more than that, where it doesn't match up. And they're.
I'm not going to say how often it doesn't match up, but I want to say this. Abraham Ibn Ezra pointed out that the calculation of Easter was not correct. It was not correct. The Jewish calculation of the 19-year cycle is correct in the sense of trying to follow what Dionysus Exiguus meant it to be. In other words, the Jewish calculated calendar fits what the theory for Easter Sunday was always supposed to fit. But the calculation for Easter Sunday is sometimes wrong, and that's why there's a month discrepancy between Easter Sunday and the Jewish Passover in the calculated calendar. However, there's another fellow who wrote in London. He also rediscovered the error in the calculation for Easter. He rediscovered it. And that book was published in 1877. And I found that book at the Boston Public Library. It's the only place that I found that book. I was looking for 20 years trying to find a copy of that book. And I finally found it in the Boston Public Library. And I photocopied several pages from that book. And I quote from that book in this historical departure from the biblical calendar. I quote from that book published in 1877 that I photocopied part of at the Boston Public Library. It was about the year 1987 I found that book at the Boston Public Library. But let me try to think. The author's name, it begins with a B. It's in that book. It's in the historical departure of the biblical calendar. I quote from that book, and that book is referenced in that. And I quote from him. He quotes that he writes about Dionysus Exiguus, and that quote is in this historical departure from the biblical calendar. Anyway, that's it. So we got a whole lot in this discussion, more than just the equinox. We got into a discussion about the history of the calculated calendar, when it originated, about the year 800. It was designed in such a way to make the Passover fall shortly before Easter Sunday. That's how the Jews designed it.
You can read that. Okay. Yeah, the only other question, I don't know how much longer you might keep going with, and I know this might be a little off topic, but she asked, can you ask Herb about high Passover and the standard when Jesus died? Because I guess like John, the book of John mentions it was a high Passover. So I guess she's asking about that. Can you ask him about the high Passover and I don't know what she means by standard when Jesus died, though.
Well, there's a lot of controversy over the whether the death of the crucifixion, what day of the week it was. There are many people, because of talking about 3 days and 3 nights, they teach a Wednesday crucifixion. And then there are other people that teach a Thursday crucifixion, and other people teach a Friday crucifixion. And I have photocopied about 2,000 pages of different viewpoints, some of them favoring the Wednesday crucifixion, some a Thursday crucifixion, and some a Friday crucifixion. Now, that subject is a subject which is a very, very, very difficult subject. I will make one comment about it, though, and that is the week leading up to the crucifixion is very, very detailed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you take a harmony of the Gospels, which I've spent a good deal of time harmonizing the last week leading up to the crucifixion, if the crucifixion was on a Wednesday and you go back day by day by day to the triumphal entry on a donkey in Matthew, the triumphal entry on a donkey would be on the Sabbath. And Yeshua would have been accused of violating the Sabbath by riding an animal on the Sabbath. Because on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to make your animals work. Neither you, nor your maidservant, nor your maidservant, nor your animals are supposed to work on the Sabbath. And so Wednesday crucifixion, if you go backwards day by day by day, would cause Yeshua to be entering on a donkey on the Sabbath. And that's what is the problem with the Wednesday crucifixion. And so people who believe in the Wednesday crucifixion, unless you can monkey around in some weird way, which I can't see, with the week leading up to the crucifixion, it would make Yeshua entering on the Sabbath. And it doesn't make sense. So the only other choices are a Thursday or a Friday. Now, I am not going to take up a lot of time with that. It's something that most people think was a Friday. It's a little difficult to understand how you get somehow 3 days and 3 nights with the Friday crucifixion, because the resurrection was, after all, on the first day of the week, according to the scripture. So I leave that with you, but I don't have a definitive remark on that. All I can say is that if the crucifixion was on a Wednesday, then riding on a donkey would have been on the Sabbath, according to the last week chronology. So be it.
Yeah, that's kind of the same issue. I believe in a Wednesday, but I do have that issue with it. Like I gotta say that's probably the most. I can get everything else to match up, but that's the biggest issue I have with it. Because I was like, I mean, unless you can somehow say that it's, I think I do have a way, one way, and I'd like to present that to someone and see what they think. But other than that, I can't think of it off the top of my head. One workaround about that. But the only other workaround I could think is if because it was like if it was like some way of religious use. But I'm not sure if that would work. I haven't looked into that. That argument.
The Jews to this day use the term high day to refer to a day of a festival. In other words, they speak of the high holy days. And the word high is intended to be a reference to a holy day, a day in which it to do no laborious work, like the first day and the last day of unleavened bread, like the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles and the 8th day. Those are called high days. The Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, is a high day. The first day of the 7th month is a high day. They're called high days. So when it says that day was a high day, that Sabbath was a high day. First of all, the word Sabbath is ambiguous in a certain sense in the first century. Let me explain about the use of the word Sabbath. Horace, a poet, a Roman poet, wrote poetry in Latin. And he wrote satires. And one of his satires that was written about the year 10 BCE, written about the year 10 BCE, one of his satires, there's a mocking of the Jewish, what they call the 30th Sabbath. And the phrase in the Latin, Tricesima Sabbata, means the 30th Sabbath. And the 30th Sabbath, according to modern Jewish scholars, means the 30th day of the month that the Jews counted as a Sabbath. Now, it was not the Sabbath. It was not the weekly Sabbath. It was not a high day either. But the Jews did not want to work on the new moon day. And because the Jews did not want to work on a new moon day, they called it the Sabbath. It's a way of getting around working on a day that they didn't want to work by calling it a Sabbath. And so they developed a non-biblical terminology. The Jews developed a non-biblical terminology in which they called any day that they didn't want to work Sabbath. And since they didn't want to work on the new moon day, they called it the Sabbath. And since it was the 30th day of the month, now it might have been the 29th, it may have been on the 30th day, but they didn't know for sure which of the 2 days would be the new moon in Israel. So they just got in the habit of keeping the 30th day of the month as a Sabbath. And so Horace knew it, and Horace called it the 30th Sabbath of the Jews in his satire, one of his satires. And so the point is, I'm illustrating the fact that the use of the word Sabbath in the first century did not agree with its use in the Bible. And so when you see the word Sabbath in the New Testament, it does not necessarily have to be referring to the weekly Sabbath because of the sloppiness of the Jews' use of the word Sabbath in the first century. It would simply mean any day that they didn't want to work. So it could refer to a festival day. When it says that Sabbath was a high day, it could mean that that particular day was a holy day that the Jews called the Sabbath, or instead, it could refer to the weekly Sabbath that also was a festival day. It's ambiguous. The reason it's ambiguous means double meaning. It's possible that it could mean one of two things. It could mean the weekly Sabbath, or it could mean a festival day. Because of the fact that in the first century, the Jews did not use the word Sabbath in the same sense it did in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, because they used it to mean any day they didn't want to work. And so it's ambiguous. So when it says that day was a high Sabbath, that Sabbath was a high day, it could either mean that that Saturday was also a holy day, or instead it could mean that that high day is what the Jews call the Sabbath. It's ambiguous. I'm so sorry. That's just the way it is. Because of the culture of the Jews in the first century, the word Sabbath was used for any day they didn't want to work. Could be the weekly Sabbath, could be a festival day. It could be either one.
Could it be a day that wasn't even appointed by God, and they just call it a Sabbath so they could get the day off, right?
Could also be the new moon day. It could be the new moon day, or it could be the weekly Sabbath, or it could be the festival day that they were not supposed to work.
Okay, I never heard that. That's new to me. I'll have to really think about that.
It's new because people are not used to thinking that way, but it was pointed out that way by this satire of Horace. Horace points that out in his satire. And commentaries of the Jews today about that satire do agree with that. That the Jews called any day they didn't want to work the Sabbath. It's just ambiguous. It's a first century ambiguity.
It's pretty interesting. I have never thought about that. So that's interesting. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. I don't see any new questions. So, do you want to call tonight or?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked. What time is it now?
It's 10:45 here, so it's about 9:45 where you are, and we've been going for 3 hours and 45 minutes.
We've gone a little more than we did last week.
A little bit more, which I'm surprised. I thought it was going to be a shorter show, but that's all right. A lot of good information. I did think one point before we go. I did think one thing was kind of interesting too, is that you mentioned how before 499, the Babylonians calendar did not sync up with the Jewish calendar, and sometimes it might start its New Year a month earlier. And I thought it was real interesting that the Vatican kind of has the same issue where it's starting its month, its New Year. Well, it's supposed, its version of like the biblical calendar where it's trying to calculate Passover, and it's doing the same sort of thing where it's starting at a month earlier. I just thought that was kind of interesting where it looks like it's got that same sort of deal going on where it's not exactly lining up in a similar way.
You're also bringing up the fact that it's a 19-year cycle. The 19-year cycle for the theory of Easter and the 19-year cycle for the modern calculated Jewish calendar. They both use a 19-year cycle. The 19-year cycle is not a perfectly exact cycle. It's not exactly 19 years. Now, the discussion of that is in one of these documents that you have shown here. If you go down, I'll show you the document.
Okay, because I would be interested.
It's called Basics.
Oh, is that? Okay, that's not the top. Okay.
There's a file here called Basics. One of these files. No, you passed it. It's up there. One of them is called Basics as a name for the document. A little bit further down, a little further down.
Bridge, barley in the calendar, the start of a biblical month.
A little further down.
The equinox and how does it relate to the Babylonian calendar? When does a biblical year begin?
I'm going to have to match up the titles of the document that I gave with my son's website. There's a file that should be in here, but it's called Basics in my. I don't see the word Basics in here. Anyway, I'll have to check on how it's referenced in here. Historical departure of the biblical calendar has the thing about Easter. It has the thing about the Jewish calculated calendar, when it began, and its alignment that should be with Easter, but it isn't. And it has the document from Abraham ibn Ezra, the book that was translated and published in 2011. It has that information in historical departure from the biblical calendar. And if maybe I have to add another document to my son's website. But I'll have to add the one today, and I have to correct that one place that it should have been CE instead of BCE. I had Philo's death before his birth because I didn't put the right designation, as I should have had it CE instead of BCE. Anyway, I've rambled enough now.
Oh, it's this one right here. Because when I put my pointer on top of it, like down in the bottom left hand corner, it's showing me basics.
Yeah. This one here, when the ancient, I believe that's the one that has a discussion about the 19-year cycle. I believe that's the one. That's the one that has a more accurate discussion of how the 19-year cycle, how its inaccuracy developed. They have an appendix in there that goes into the detail of the 19-year cycle.
All right, well, I'll be sure to read that because I'm very interested in that.
But that's the document.
All right. Well, I think this is it. I don't want to. I don't want to go past 4 hours. I appreciate your time. Like this is super valuable to me, especially. That thing you cleared up about Josephus. You know, I almost quit writing a book because I was so frustrated trying to match up dates correctly, and I couldn't understand why Josephus had said that, because someone kept arguing with me that no, you know, it's when he says it's got to be an Aries, the sun's got to be an Aries, he's talking about like the zodiac or something, and
Look,
that it's got to match up to that, and that frustrated me because I couldn't figure out how to match things up.
the only document in which I go into detail about Josephus and Aries, that's in the discussion. Well, one of these documents, I think, has the word zodiac. A document for a lengthy 2-day seminar, which includes discussion of the zodiac, is this one right here.
Okay.
Yeah, that one discusses
see it.
zodiac, but the one that discusses Josephus and Aries is the one that's historical departure from the biblical
Okay.
truth. But if you really want to understand the detail of the zodiac and when it originated, it's this document here.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm definitely going to read those two, the historical departure and that one, because that whole Josephus thing. Now, the next time I get a hold of this person, because I was so frustrated and out of my mind until you told me that, oh no, they actually, when they say Aries, it means the start of the year. It doesn't mean, because I couldn't figure out how to match things up. And I was like, well, if I can't even trust Josephus, there's a lot that's going to, be an issue. So
You cannot trust Josephus, period.
well, I guess I'm still gonna have some issues.
I have a separate. I have a separate document of Josephus. It's not on this website. Maybe I need to add that one too. But well, there is a document that I want to add. I have to tell my son to add, called Ancient Astronomy and the Jews. That document, called Ancient Astronomy and the Jews, has a long chapter on Josephus. When you read that chapter, you'll understand why I say you cannot trust Josephus.
Okay. All right. So okay, that's it. And I'm glad you shared all that with me. So and everyone looks like they're pretty cool in the chat. So I appreciate your time very much, Herb. I mean, this has been awesome. I probably won't have you on soon, but I might contact you in like a month and see if you want to do another show.
Well, we'll make sure that it's a specific subject.
All right. Sure. I'll run it by people, see what they want to see most talked about and what I want most talked about, and then run it by you and see if you're up for it. So all right, sounds good. And your time's been such a blessing. I thank God for you. I thank Jesus for you, and thank thank you for sharing this time with me, because I know how hard it is to do this kind of research and how meticulous it is. So thank you very much. All right, everyone. I'll see you, and thanks for watching.
Take care.